Think about why we're fascinated by history. All those outstanding individuals and exotic peoples, the rise and fall of civilizations, and wondering why that happens. How did the classical Greeks achieve their golden age, the age of Pericles and Socrates, Euripides and Hippocrates? What explains the remarkable confluence of so many outstanding individuals in one cultural era? Jumping ahead almost 2 millennia, why did the Italian Renaissance happen? Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, Michelangelo, Raphael. Again, an outpouring of genius in the arts, sciences, and politics. Jumping ahead another 3 centuries, why did the Industrial Revolution happen with its awesome outpouring of productivity? The classical Chinese and the ancient Romans achieved impressive things technologically, but nothing on the scale of the Industrial Revolution. And why did the Industrial Revolution first take root in England and Scotland? Why not, say, in Burma or Botswana? Or what, by contrast, explains major historical declines? Why did the Roman Empire collapse? The most powerful military empire of the ancient world imploded and became defenseless before successive waves of barbarian invasions. And before the Romans, the powerful military empires of the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians also failed. Is there a common pattern at work here? Why did the French Revolution go so horribly wrong, descending into a reign of paranoia, fratricide, and terror? And why, by contrast, did the American Revolution, in many ways fighting the same kinds of battles and subject to the same desperate pressures, not go that self-destructive route? And how, a century and a half later, could the most educated nation in Europe become a Nazi dictatorship? All these questions raise issues of dramatic historic change, for better or worse. But we can also ask questions about the long stretches of time during which no significant changes take place at all. Consider, for example, the San people of the Kalahari area in southern Africa. Sometimes they're called the Bushmen. Experts estimate that for 10,000 years, the San people have existed in essentially the same way, generation after generation. Now let's put that in perspective. If a generation is 25 years or so, then 10,000 years means 400 generations of sameness. By contrast, it has only been about 20 generations since Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And consider how dramatic the changes have been in Europe and America since then. But even the 10,000 years of the San people is dwarfed by the estimated 35,000 years that the Aborigines of Australia have existed essentially the same way, generation after generation. 35,000 years ago is roughly when Neanderthal man was going extinct. Why did the cultures of the San people and the Aborigines not change for such unimaginably long stretches of time? Fascinating questions. I'm a philosopher and intellectual historian by profession, and it is my great fortune to make a living raising and thinking about questions like these. As historians, we study interesting individuals and cultures to learn how they lived, why they lived the way they lived, and what impact they had on the course of human events. As philosophers, we think more broadly and abstractly. We learn our lessons from the historians and ask, are there broader explanations about the dramatic rises and falls of some cultures, or from the static nature of others? History, from this perspective, is a huge laboratory of experiments in human living. Some of those experiments have been wildly successful. Others have led to middling results, leading their cultures to eke out an existence across the generations. And some have been outright disasters, leading to misery and death on a large scale. Can we identify the fundamental causes at work here? Can we learn why some cultures flourish, while others stagnate, collapse, or descend into horror? Is there a moral to the story of history? Let's start with one major historical experiment, one that turned out to be one of the darkest eras in human history. How could Nazism happen? Important question. Professors and teachers the world over used the Nazis as a prime example of evil, and rightly so. The Nazis were enormously destructive in their 12-year regime, killing 20 million people. They were not the most destructive regime of the 20th century. Joseph Stalin and the communist dictators in the Soviet Union killed 60 million. Mao Zedong and the communists in China killed 35 million. The Nazis killed 20 million people, and they undoubtedly would have killed millions more had they not been defeated. So it is important to learn the lesson here and to get it right. After coming to power in 1933 by democratic and constitutional means, the Nazis quickly turned Germany into a dictatorship. For 6 years they prepared for war, which began in 1939. And during a horrific world war in which every human and economic resource was needed for military purposes, the Nazis devoted huge amounts of resources to an attempt to exterminate the Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, and others. But what exactly is the lesson of history here? How could a civilized European nation plunge itself and the world into such horror? A common explanation is that the Germans lost World War I. They were bitter over the loss and the harsh punitive measures imposed by the victors in the Versailles Treaty. There's a grain of truth here, but I think this is a weak explanation. One reason why it's weak is that many countries lose bitter wars, but they don't respond to the loss by electing Adolf Hitlers to power. Another reason why it's weak is that Germany's losing World War I does not explain Italy. In 1922, Italy turned to Benito Mussolini and his fascist version of National Socialism. But Italy was on the winning side in World War I. So if one of the winners of World War I turns to fascism, and one of the losers of World War I also turns to fascism, then whether you were a winner or a loser in the war is not the decisive factor here. Another explanation suggests that Germany's economic troubles in the 1920s were the primary cause of National Socialism. Here again there's a grain of truth, but again I think this is a weak explanation. Many countries suffer from economic troubles, but very few of them turn to National Socialism for the solution. There's also the phenomenon of Nazi and neo-Nazi movements throughout the 20th century in the relatively prosperous nations of the world. Very few countries suffering from economic troubles go Nazi, and there are plenty of Nazi sympathizers in the wealthy nations of the world. Another weak explanation suggests that there is something innately wrong with Germans, that history shows that they are inherently militaristic, bloodthirsty, genocidal, and that the Nazis merely tapped into and exaggerated innate German tendencies. This kind of explanation is of course an insult to the millions upon millions of Germans who were appalled by National Socialism and who fought vigorously against it. It also does not explain how Nazism has been attractive to people of many races and ethnicities. In 2005, I was surprised to read that Hitler's Mein Kampf was a bestseller in the country of Turkey. Do we want to suggest that the Turks are inherently bloodthirsty and genocidal? I don't think so. Another weak explanation holds that Nazism is explained in terms of the personal neuroses and psychoses of the leadership. On this argument, Adolf Hitler was, for example, bitterly disappointed at being rejected for art school, or that he was a repressed homosexual, or that his right-hand man, Joseph Goebbels, was compensating for his below-average height or having a club foot. To all these explanations, I say, oh, come on. How many art school rejects turn to National Socialism? How many repressed homosexuals or handicapped men become Nazis? This explanation also ignores the rather large number of very powerful Nazis who were neither handicapped nor homosexual nor particularly interested in art. Any of the above explanations can work together with the suggestion that the Nazis were a product of modern communications technologies. That as masters of rhetoric and propaganda, they succeeded in fooling millions of Germans about their agenda and manipulated their way into power. I have some sympathy for this way of thinking, for I think it's the kind of explanation that comes naturally to those of us raised in Western liberal democracies. I know that when I first started learning about the Nazis, I found it hard to imagine them as anything but insane. How could Nazism be anything but the product of deranged minds manipulating the masses? But I want to suggest two reasons why I think it's not a good idea to dismiss the Nazis as mere manipulators, insane or not. The first reason is that the Nazis came to power by democratic and constitutional methods. When the party was formed in 1920, it was a small fringe party. But it spoke to the beliefs and aspirations of millions of Germans. And Germany was, in the 1920s, arguably the most educated nation in the world, with the highest levels of literacy, most number of years of schooling on average, newspaper readership, political awareness, and so on. It was in an educated nation that the Nazis came to power. Now, millions of voters in a democracy may be wrong, but it's hard to argue that they were deluded. A better explanation, I think, is that they knew what they were voting for and thought that the Nazis represented the best hope for Germany's future. But millions of voters in a democracy don't decide spontaneously to vote for this party or that. A mass political movement requires that much cultural groundwork be done over the course of many years. And this is where intellectuals do their work. Intellectuals develop a culture's ideals, its hopes, its aspirations, in books, magazines, sermons, radio broadcasts. It's intellectuals who are a culture's opinion shapers. It's intellectuals who write the opinion pieces for the mass newspapers, who are the professors at the universities where the next generation of teachers and preachers and politicians and lawyers and physicians are all getting their educations. And this leads me to the other reason why I think it's a weak explanation to say that the Nazis were simply deranged and lucked or manipulated their way into power. Consider the following list of intellectuals who supported the Nazis long before the Nazis came to power. The list represents a veritable who's who list of powerful minds and cultural leaders. Gerhard Hauptmann, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1912. Hauptmann once met Adolf Hitler and described their brief handshake as the greatest moment of his life. Philippe Lenard, winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1905. Johannes Stark, also winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1919. That's 3 Nobel Prize winners. Then there is Dr. Oswald Spengler, author of the historical bestseller The Decline of the West. Spengler's books sold in the millions, and during the 1920s, he was perhaps Germany's most famous intellectual. Then there is Müller Vandenbroek, another famous public intellectual of the 1920s. His book, The Third Reich, published in 1923, provided a theoretical rationale for National Socialism, and his book, like Spengler's books, was a consistent bestseller throughout the 1920s. Then there's Dr. Carl Schmitt, probably the sharpest legal and political mind of his generation. Schmitt's books are still widely read and discussed by political theoreticians of all stripes and are considered 20th century classics. And to round out this initial list, there is philosopher Martin Heidegger. Already in the 1920s, Heidegger was being hailed as the brightest philosophical mind of his generation. And that is saying a lot in a philosophical nation such as Germany. And that assessment has held over the course of the 20th century. Ask professional philosophers of today to identify, say, the 5 most influential philosophers of the 20th century, and, whether they love him or loathe him, most will name Heidegger. These 7 men are some of the most powerful and intelligent minds in Germany in the decade before the Nazis came to power. They are leading figures in Germany's intellectual culture, spanning arts, sciences, politics, history, law, philosophy, and all of them to one degree or another supported National Socialism. Was Hitler smart enough to fool all of these highly intelligent men? Or is it more likely that they knew what they believed and they supported National Socialism because they thought it was true? So I want to suggest a better explanation. Here it is. The primary cause of Nazism lies in philosophy, not economics, not psychology, not even politics, philosophy. National Socialism was first a philosophy of life believed and advocated by highly intelligent men and women. Professors, public intellectuals, Nobel Prize winners, powerful minds working at the cutting edges of their disciplines. It was they who shaped the intellectual culture of Germany in the 1920s and who convinced millions of Germans that National Socialism was the best hope for Germany's future. This is not to say that there weren't other contributing factors. The legacy of World War I, persistent economic troubles, the personal psychologies of the Nazi leadership all played a role. But the most significant role was played by an abstract set of philosophical ideas. National Socialism was a philosophy-intensive movement. Now maybe you're thinking, here's this Stephen Hicks guy, that's me, who's a philosopher suggesting that National Socialism is primarily about philosophy. Talk about being a hammer and seeing every problem as a nail. Well, let me up the ante even further. I want also to suggest that the Nazi intellectuals and their followers thought of themselves as idealists, as crusaders for a noble cause. Now this may be even harder to swallow. The National Socialists of the 1920s were passionate men and women who thought that the world was in a crisis and that a moral revolution was called for. They believed their ideas to be true, beautiful, noble, and the only hope for the world. Yes, Nazi ideology contains major elements of harshness and brutality, but what if an important truth about the world is that it is harsh and brutal? It may be hard to believe that the Nazis thought of themselves as noble idealists, especially with our after-the-fact knowledge of the horrible destructiveness of Nazism. It may be even harder for those of us raised in Western liberal democracies to believe it, since from the cradle we've been raised to believe that freedom, equality, and peace are almost self-evidently good. But what if they aren't self-evidently good? Let me play devil's advocate for a moment here. For how long have human beings existed? Most anthropologists will say that Homo sapiens has been around for over 100,000 years. For how much of that time have freedom, equality, and peace been the norm? In classical Greece, democratic experiments were tried for a few centuries. A little later, the Roman Republic experimented with republican institutions, again for a few centuries. But both Greece and Rome failed. The Greeks were conquered by the Romans, and the Romans then slipped into authoritarian decadence before themselves being conquered. Two short-lived experiments in 100,000 years. Not very impressive. So now we imagine ourselves in Europe in the earliest decades of the 20th century. Democratic republicanism has been resurrected and is being tried again, for example, in the United States. But how successful have the modern experiments been? Come the 1920s, the United States is only about 150 years old, which means it has survived for less time than either the Greek democracies or the Roman Republic. The United States lasted only 90 years before plunging itself into a brutal civil war, the reverberations of which are still being felt in the 20th century. In the 1920s, the U.S. is itself experiencing economic uncertainty and is shortly to plunge into its Great Depression. Even in the U.S., many intellectuals are suggesting that capitalism and democracy are finished, and some form of centralized authority led by a strong man is the wave of the future. So, come the 1920s, just how strong is the case for capitalism, liberalism, democracy, republicanism? What if a culture's brightest intellectuals believe that democracy is a historical blip? What if they believe that the lesson of history is that what people need is structure and strong leadership? What if they think that history shows that some cultures are obviously superior to others, superior in their arts, their science and technology, their religion? What if they believe that history shows that we live in a harsh world of conflict, and that in such a world, strength and assertiveness against your enemies are necessary to survive? Or even more strongly than that peace makes a people soft, and that by contrast, it is conflict and war that brings out the best in people, making them tough and vigorous and willing to fight for their ideals and, if necessary, die for them. I'm suggesting that a set of ideals was primarily responsible for the rise of Nazism. I think those ideals are extraordinarily false and terribly destructive, but that is not how millions of educated, intelligent, and in many cases well-meaning Germans saw them. But why do I call them a set of ideals? Why not just say the Nazis had some ideas? Of course they had some ideas with which to bewitch the masses, but basically they just wanted power and were effective at using those ideas to get power. Well, of course the Nazis wanted power. What politician doesn't want power? But if you're just out for power, think about how you go about getting it in a democracy. The best way is to identify the established political parties, join one of the more powerful ones, and work your way up the ranks to the top. Here's an analogy. In the United States, the two major parties are the Democratic and Republican parties. So if you're young and ambitious and you want a realistic chance of becoming senator or even president in your lifetime, you join one of those two parties. What you do not do is join a fringe party. What you do not do is start your own party out in the middle of nowhere, say the Midwestern Farmers Union Party. The only reason you would start the Midwestern Farmers Union Party is if you were a true believer in the ideals of Midwestern farming and thought you could not achieve your ideals by joining with one of the established parties. But that describes the Nazis exactly. They did not join the Social Democrats or any of the established political parties. They set up their own fringe party in the south of Germany and away from the centers of power in Berlin. They were true believers in a cause. They did not want power if it meant compromising their ideals by joining with an established political party. They wanted power, but power to achieve what they took to be high ideals. So what was this obscure political party formed in Munich in 1920, and what did it stand for? The Nazi Party grew out of the DAP, the German Workers' Party. The goal of the party, according to one of its founders, Gottfried Feder, was to reconcile nationalism and socialism. It was a lecture by Gottfried Feder in 1919 that attracted Adolf Hitler to the party. Yet within a year, the party changed its name in order to have a name that more accurately expressed its core political principles. The new name of the party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. At a rally in Munich in 1920, with over 2,000 participants, the party announced its new platform, a 25-point program. The main authors of the program were Hitler, Feder, and a third man named Anton Drexler. To understand what National Socialism stood for, the main points of the program are worth a closer look. A major theme of the program is a stress upon collectivism and a rejection of individualism. Point number 10 of the program, for example, says that it must be the first duty of every citizen to perform mental or physical work. Individual activity must not violate the general interest, but must be exercised within the framework of the community and for the general good. National Socialism thus consciously rejects Western liberal individualism with its rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all of which are individualistic. Nazism is collectivistic. It does not hold that individuals have their own lives to live and happinesses to pursue. Rather, individuals should work for the good of the community out of a sense of duty. Individuals should serve the general good, to which they subordinate their personal lives. Point number 24 returns to this theme and emphasizes it strongly. The common interest before self-interest. The bold print and the capitalization is in the original for emphasis. A second major theme of the Nazi program is a stress upon socialism and a strong rejection of capitalism. Numerically, socialism is the most emphasized part of the Nazi program. For over half of its 25 themes, 14 out of the 25 to be exact, itemize economically socialist demands. Point number 11 calls for the abolition of all income gained by loaning money at interest. Point number 12 demands the confiscation of all profits earned by German businesses during World War I. Point 13 demands the nationalization of all corporations. Point 14 demands the profit sharing in large industrial enterprises. Point 15 demands the generous development of state-run old age insurance. Point 16 calls for the immediate socialization of the huge department stores. And so on. So strong was the party's commitment to socialism that in 1921 it entered into negotiations to merge with another socialist party, the German Socialist Party. The negotiations fell through, but a commitment to economic socialism remained a key Nazi theme through the 1920s. For example, here is Adolf Hitler in a speech in 1927. We are socialists. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance, and we are all determined to destroy this system under all conditions. Even more strongly than Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels hated capitalism and urged socialism. Dr. Joseph Goebbels was perhaps the most brilliant and educated of all of the Nazi politicians, and when the Nazis came to power, he was to become one of the most powerful of the very top Nazis, perhaps number 2 or 3 behind Hitler himself. But Goebbels' commitment to National Socialist principles began much earlier. He received a wide-ranging classical education from 5 universities in Germany before receiving his PhD degree from Heidelberg University in 1921. During his graduate student days, he absorbed and agreed with much of the writings of communists Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Damning those he called, quote, the money pigs of capitalist democracy, unquote, Goebbels in speeches and pamphlets regularly declaimed that, quote, money has made slaves of us, unquote. Money, he argued, is the curse of mankind. It smothers the seed of everything great and good. Every penny is sticky with sweat and blood. And in language that could be right out of the writings of Karl Marx, Goebbels believed fervently, the worker in a capitalist state, and that is his deepest misfortune, is no longer a living human being, a creator, a maker. He has become a machine, a number, a cog in the machine without sense or understanding. He is alienated from what he produces. The Nazi solution, then, is strong socialism. The state should control the economy, organizing production and distribution in the collective interest. But this raises a question. So far, the Nazi program has emphasized that collectivism and socialism take precedence over the individual, but what collective social grouping takes precedence? Here, the Nazis emphatically define their collectivism in terms of nationalism. Individuals belong primarily to racial and ethnic groups, and it's their racial and ethnic groups that give them their core identities. In the Nazi program, 7 out of the 25 points speak directly to this issue. The issue is a little complicated here because the Nazis have 3 enemies in mind whom they are careful to distinguish themselves from. First, they reject Marxist socialism, or any socialism that puts economic groupings first. As much as the Nazis hate capitalism, they do not see the world as a battle between economic interests. To them, the Marxists are too narrowly focused on money. But money is only part of the real battle. The real battle is between different biological and cultural groups, groups with different languages, religions, values, laws, histories. For them, the battle is between Germans with their particular biological and cultural inheritance against all of the other racial cultures of the world. Second, the Nazis reject cosmopolitanism, an ideal of Western liberals who believe that human beings are essentially the same the world over, and who think that one should strive to be a citizen of the world, at home anywhere your travels might take you. The Nazis are nationalists, and they reject any form of internationalism or cosmopolitanism. These themes explain why the Nazis designed the swastika flag as they did, as a symbolic integration of socialism and nationalism. Red is symbolic of socialism, white is symbolic of nationalism, and the swastika symbol itself, according to Hitler, is symbolic of the Aryan struggle for supremacy against a world that is trying to destroy the Germans. And so in the Nazi program of 1920, we have several points about German national identity and asserting German needs and goals. Point 1 demands the unification of all ethnic Germans into a greater Germany. Point 8 demands that immigration by non-Germans be halted and that all those who have immigrated recently be expelled from the country. Public offices can be open only to citizens, and point 3 defines citizenship in terms of the possession of German blood. And the possession of German blood is defined carefully to eliminate a third target of the Nazis, those whom they hate even more than the Marxists or the liberal capitalists, and that is the Jews. Point 3 of the program denies that Jews can be racial comrades of the Germans, and this point, in combination with the other points, effectively shuts the Jews out of German life. In this poster, we can see the 3 heads of the dragon: the communist, the international capitalist, and the Jew, the enemies the pure German warrior must defeat. From the beginning of the party in 1920, the strong German nationalism and anti-Semitism are, like the collectivism and the socialism, core Nazi themes. While the 1920 program mentions the Jews only twice and seems to recommend only that the Jews be forced to leave Germany, within a few years the Nazi leadership has decided upon harsher measures. In 1925, for example, Hitler published Mein Kampf, a book that sold increasingly well as the Nazis rose to power. On page 471, we find an ambiguous statement to the effect that the Nazis' goal should be, quote, the total removal of the Jews, unquote. But a little later in the book, Hitler has eliminated all ambiguity and called for genocide. Quote, we must exterminate the Jews, unquote. So far, the Nazi program has 3 major themes: collectivism, socialism, nationalism. The next question is, how do the Nazis think this is to be achieved? As early as 1920s, the Nazis made it very clear that they are no friends of liberalism, democracy, or republicanism. They favor strong authoritarianism and centralized power. Point 23 calls for censorship and government control of all newspapers. Point 24 suggests limitations on religions that do not fit the Nazis' goals. Point 25 calls for centralization and unconditional power. Quote, we demand the creation of a strong central power in Germany. A central political parliament should possess unconditional authority over the entire Reich and its organization in general. Unquote. These points, in combination with the economic socialist points earlier, give the government complete control over all aspects of society. All through the 1920s, the Nazis are unapologetic about wanting to eliminate democracy, liberalism, and republicanism. Goebbels, for example, put it bluntly and publicly. Never do the people rule themselves. This madness has been invented by liberalism. Behind its concept of the sovereignty of the people hide the most corrupt rogues who do not want to be recognized. So, he continues, We shall create a power group with which we can conquer this state, and then ruthlessly and brutally, using the state's prerogatives, we shall enforce our will and our program. And again from Goebbels, history has seen repeatedly how a young, determined minority has overthrown the rule of a corrupt and rotten majority, and then used for a time the state and its means of power in order to bring about by dictatorship and force the conditions necessary to complete the conquest and to impose new ideas. So the Nazis were very clear from the outset what they were in favor of, what they were opposed to, and how they planned to exercise power once they achieved it. Socialism, nationalism, racial identity and purification, and a strong centralized government to make it happen. It is important to emphasize again that the Nazis put their program forward forthrightly and as a noble, even spiritual ideal to achieve. They promised not merely another political platform, but a whole philosophy of life that they and their followers believed promised renewal. And they called upon the Germans to exercise the highest spirit of altruism and self-sacrifice for the good of the community to make that renewal possible. Program point number 10 urges individuals to put the common interest before their self-interest. Point number 24 repeats it. Hitler and Goebbels repeatedly urged Nazism as a noble and spiritual ideal vision in contrast to the usual power-grubbing politics of the day. In Mein Kampf, Hitler insists, all force which does not spring from a firm spiritual foundation will be hesitating and uncertain. It lacks the stability which can only rest on a fanatical view of life. He calls upon individuals not to be selfish, but to be willing to sacrifice. The preservation of the existence of a species presupposes a spirit of sacrifice in the individual. In Goebbels' autobiographical novel, Michael, a work that sold out of 17 editions, the lead character is explicitly likened to Jesus Christ. Michael is the Christ socialist who sacrifices himself out of a love of mankind, and Goebbels urges that Germans be willing to do the same for the greater good. Returning to this poster, note in the background the religiously spiritual figure with his arm encircling the young German soldier. Hitler regularly praises Germans for their spirit of altruism. This state of mind, which subordinates the interests of the ego to the conservation of the community, is really the first premise for every truly human civilization. Altruism, he thinks, is a character trait more pronounced in Germans than in any other culture, which is why he claimed to be so optimistic about Germany's future. This message of National Socialism as a moral ideal and a spiritual crusade was appealing to many, many Germans, and especially among the young. By 1925, for example, 2/3 of the Nazi Party membership in the north of Germany is young, under 30 years of age. And within a very few years, the Nazis will have attracted a large following among university students. And Goebbels especially calls out to the idealistic young to be the heart of the Nazi future in Germany. The old ones don't even want to understand that we young people even exist. They defend their power to the last. But one day they will be defeated after all. Youth finally must be victorious. We young ones, we shall attack. The attacker is always stronger than the defender. If we free ourselves, we can also liberate the whole working class. And the liberated working class will release the fatherland from its chains. For the Nazis, the clear, firm, and passionate advocacy of their political ideals, along with efficient organization and propaganda, brought them increasing democratic success in Germany. After years of work, by 1928 the party had only 12 seats in the Reichstag, Germany's national parliament. But in the election of September 1930, they increased that number to 107 seats. Less than 2 years later, in the election of July 1932, they increased that number dramatically to 230 seats. A few months later, they lost 34 seats in a November election and now had 196. But in January of 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor, one of the two highest offices in the land, and the Nazis are now in a position to consolidate their power. In March of 1933, they call yet another election in order to get a clear mandate from the German people about their plans for Germany. The election has a huge turnout, and the Nazis score huge gains, winning 43.9% of the popular vote and 288 seats in the Reichstag. 288 seats is more seats than their next three competitors combined. As the Nazis had promised, they moved quickly to transform Germany from a constitutional democracy into an authoritarian dictatorship. An early step they took was to get rid of all rival political parties. Some were banned outright, the rest were pressured to dissolve themselves, and in July of 1933 the Nazis banned the formation of new political parties. In 1934 the Nazis further consolidated their power and augmented Hitler's. Hitler had almost always had a strong grip on the internal politics of the Nazi Party, but it had never been absolute. 1934 brought an internal purge and an elimination of Hitler's rivals. The triggering event was Ernst Röhm's attempted rebellion. Röhm had been head of the SA, the Storm Division, which was the paramilitary wing of the party. Röhm had used his position to form a rival power bloc and secretly attempted a rebellion. Hitler had been warned ahead of time of the rebellion and was able to suppress it. In the purge that followed, 43 conspirators and rivals were executed. And along with the purge, there were many unofficial assassinations as old scores within the party were settled. The result of all the bloodletting was a Nazi party united even more strongly around Adolf Hitler. In August of the same year, President Hindenburg died. Paul von Hindenburg had been the grand old man of German politics, holding the office of the presidency, which along with the chancellorship was one of the two highest offices in the land. Upon Hindenburg's death, Hitler effectively merged the office of the presidency and the chancellorship, thus augmenting his power further. In a nationwide plebiscite to confirm the merger, almost 90% of Germans voted in favor of augmenting Hitler's power. The Nazis now controlled all the major political offices, they had cleaned house internally, and they had gotten rid of all the rival political parties. In firm control, they then set about reshaping all of German society. Political tools such as physical force and authoritarian laws are necessary for a dictatorship, but long-term control of a people also requires controlling their minds. The Nazis recognized this and made reshaping Germany's educational system a high priority. They already had a good start. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, about 2.5 million Germans were members of the Nazi Party. 7% were members of the upper class, 7% were peasants, 35% were industrial workers, and the largest group, 51%, were members of the professional and middle classes. Surprisingly, in this latter group, the professional and middle classes, the single largest occupational group represented was elementary school teachers. The Nazis thus already had a core group of followers in a position to help them shape the minds of the next generation. The Nazis had a particular kind of youth in mind. As early as 1925, Hitler had written in Mein Kampf the following: "The Volkisch state must not adjust its entire educational work primarily to the inoculation of mere knowledge, but to the breeding of absolutely healthy bodies. The training of mental abilities is only secondary." Come 1933 and power, Hitler repeatedly made it even clearer what kind of healthy bodies he wanted the educational system to produce. "My program for educating youth is hard. Weakness must be hammered away. In my castles of the Teutonic Order, a youth will grow up before which the world will tremble. I want a brutal, domineering, fearless, cruel youth. Youth must be all that. It must bear pain. There must be nothing weak and gentle about it. The free, splendid beast of prey must once again flash from its eyes. That is how I will eradicate thousands of years of human domestication. That is how I will create the new order." Intellectual training was less emphasized than physical training, but it was not omitted. Students were trained in Nazi ideology, they studied German history from a National Socialist perspective, they were trained in political activism, and they taught themselves to develop a selfless, obedient, duty-oriented moral character. The curriculum was revised, textbooks were rewritten, and teachers were recruited as servants of the cause. Early in the Nazi regime, teachers were declared to be civil servants and required to join the National Socialist Teachers League, swearing an oath of absolute fidelity to Adolf Hitler. In addition to transforming the formal school system, the Nazis placed great emphasis on the Hitler Youth Organization. The party's youth organization had been formed in 1922, early in the party's history, though it acquired its Hitler Youth name in 1926. The purpose of the Hitler Youth was to form a cadre of devoted young followers outside the formal school system. Boys could join the program at age 6, though formal training began at age 10. All members of the Hitler Youth swore this oath. In the presence of this blood banner, which represents our Führer, I swear to devote all my energies and my strength to the savior of our country, Adolf Hitler. I am ready and willing to give up my life for him, so help me God. Full membership and systematic training began at age 14 and included being able to take a physical beating without whining. Brutal fighting sessions among the boys were common and encouraged, as Hitler had put in Mein Kampf. But above all, the young, healthy body must also learn to suffer blows. If a boy was unable to withstand the pain or pressure, he was embarrassed in front of his peers. Those who succeeded, though, received accolades, a sense of belonging to a great cause, and useful symbols of their status, such as this special dagger. Parallel programs existed for girls, instruction focused on home, family, and the duty to bear children. Training of the girls was similar to the training of the boys, including wearing military-style uniforms, engaging in soldier-like activities, and learning Nazi ideology and activism. Although the members of the Hitler Youth were encouraged to question their parents, their non-Nazi teachers, and church officials, within the Hitler Youth, absolute obedience was demanded. Despite this, membership in the Hitler Youth was appealing to many young Germans. Summer camps and parades were regular Hitler Youth activities. There was also a feeling of camaraderie and a sense of developing self-discipline, honor, and loyalty. Membership in the Hitler Youth came to be a badge of honor, and as the Nazi Party came closer to realizing power, even became a status symbol. In 1932, the year before the Nazi Party came to power, the Hitler Youth had about 108,000 members, or about 5% of the German youth population. Within a year, membership in the Hitler Youth had swollen to over 2 million members. In 1936, membership in the Hitler Youth was made mandatory. All other German youth groups had ceased to exist, been absorbed into the Hitler Youth, or abolished. And by 1939, the year that World War II was to begin, membership in the Hitler Youth reached almost 8 million members. The Nazis had also achieved great success with older students, those of university age. Well before Hitler came to power, Nazi student groups existed at universities all over Germany. Before 1933, it was a common sight to see students wearing brown shirts and swastika armbands in class. And in many cases, it was the most intelligent and idealistic university students who were the most activist and outspoken supporters of National Socialism. And the students had many allies among their professors. When the National Socialists came to power, they prohibited all Jews from holding academic positions. This resulted in the firing of hundreds of Jewish professors, including at least 5 Nobel laureates. To their credit, many other professors resigned in protest or emigrated, but such professors were in the small minority. But a large majority of university professors remained on the job, either passively accepting the new regime or even actively supporting it. In 1933, for example, 960 professors, including such prominent figures as philosopher Martin Heidegger, made a public proclamation of support for Adolf Hitler and the new National Socialist regime. The photo shows Martin Heidegger at a Nazi party rally in 1933. What the Nazis established for the schools and universities, they attempted to establish for German society at large by means of sweeping government regulations on media and outright censorship. The world of schools and education was merely an important microcosm of the Nazis' plans for all of German society. Joseph Goebbels, Germany's new propaganda chief, put it this way: "Any book or work of art which acts subversively on our future or strikes at the root of German thought, the German home, and the driving forces of our people should be destroyed." The great symbolic event of what was to come occurred early in the Nazi regime, the May 10, 1933 book burnings, just a few months after the Nazis assumed power. In an open square across from the University of Berlin, 20,000 books were burned in a huge bonfire. Joseph Goebbels spoke at the event to 40,000 cheering spectators. Some of the authors whose books were destroyed include Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, Jack London, Helen Keller, H.G. Wells, Sigmund Freud, Émile Zola, and Marcel Proust. An important and sometimes overlooked fact about the book burnings is that they were not instigated by the Nazi government, nor were they instigated by non-intellectual thugs. The book burnings were instigated by university students. The Nazi student organization conceived and executed the book burnings all over Germany that night. Book bonfires burned brightly in every German university city. The professors had taught their students well. Goebbels' official title was Minister for the Reich Chamber of Culture. The Reich Chamber of Culture controlled 7 major cultural spheres: art, music, theater, literature, the press, radio, and film. This gave Goebbels control over all of the German media and enabled him to use effectively his formidable talent for propaganda. He quickly established regulations that anyone working in any of those cultural fields had to become a member of the Nazi Party and join the respective cultural chamber. The purpose of the regulations, as Goebbels put it, in order to pursue a policy of German culture, it is necessary to gather together the creative artists in all spheres into a unified organization under the leadership of the Reich. The Reich must not only determine the lines of progress, mental and spiritual, but also lead and organize the professions. In the realm of art, Hitler and Goebbels attempted to cleanse Germany of modern art and to replace it with Germanic art. Classical plays, music, and opera were still allowed, as were Hollywood B-movies, but galleries exhibiting modern art were shut down. Newspapers received close supervision. The Reich Press Law of 1933 prohibited editors from marrying Jews and required that the editors meet daily with the propaganda ministry to ensure that no misleading stories were published. Essentially, this gave the government power to tell the newspapers what they could and could not print. Likewise, radio was taken over in 1933 by a branch of the propaganda ministry, the Chamber of Radio. The Chamber of Film took over the content of the film industry, though it left the production of films up to private firms. In all areas of art and culture, uncooperative editors, writers, or performers were ousted, or sent to prison, or sent to concentration camps, or sometimes killed. Editors, performers, and writers who remained knew how they were expected to behave. All of German culture thus became an obedient tool of Nazi politics. Nazi education and censorship attempted to control people's minds, but the Nazis also controlled people's bodies as much as possible. Milder controls involved new public health measures, such as an aggressive campaign against smoking. The Nazis banned smoking in certain public places, placed restrictions on how tobacco could be advertised, and ran an aggressive anti-smoking campaign. Stronger controls extended to people's sex and reproductive lives, and here we enter darker territory: the Nazi embrace of eugenics. Eugenics was not unique to the Nazis or to Germany. As early as 1895, eugenics researcher Adolf Jost published a book called The Right to Death, which called for state control of reproduction. And many intellectuals in many countries embraced eugenics. In nature, the argument runs, only the strongest males get to mate with the females, while the weaker males mate less frequently or not at all. This natural selection of the strong and deselection of the weaker serves to keep the species healthy and makes it stronger. The same principle holds for farming. Just as a farmer is concerned to improve the quality of his herd, the state should be concerned to improve the quality of its citizenry. The farmer will not let any old bull mate with any old cow, so the state should not let any male have sex with any female. The farmer will select only his healthiest and strongest bulls and let them mate only with his strongest and healthiest cows. Any cows or bulls not up to snuff will be culled from the herd and not allowed to reproduce at all. As Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer of the Reich, would say a little later, National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. Before the Nazis came to power, German intellectuals were among the world leaders of eugenics research. Dr. Ernst Rudin was the president of the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations. In 1920, psychiatry professor Alfred Hock and Judge Carl Binding jointly published a book called The Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Life. Their book called for the destruction of unworthy human beings in favor of protecting worthy human beings. So-called worthless individuals included the mentally and physically disabled. Another book, The Principles of Human Heredity and Racial Hygiene by Doctors Fischer, Lenz, and Bauer, hailed the superiority of the German race and called for the use of concentration camps for non-Germans and mixed races. Fischer already had experience with this. In South Africa, he had planned and executed the forced sterilization of the offspring of German military men with indigenous South African women. By the time the Nazis came to power, eugenics was an established part of German intellectual life. One striking indication of this is that German universities had 23 official professors of racial hygiene. National Socialism held that the state should take over where natural selection left off. In line with their collectivism and anti-individualism, they believed that medicine and reproduction should serve the interests of the state, not the individual. Like the farmer, the Nazis wanted high-quality Aryan children, so they took charge of the mating process of Germany's citizens. The Reich could not allow individuals to rut with just anyone. Taking away individual choice would improve the stock of the nation and cleanse it of inferior genetic elements. The Nazis thus argued that they were more strongly socialist than their arch rivals, the communists. While the communists were almost exclusively focused on issues of money, capitalism, and economics, the Nazis argued for a more comprehensive socialism. Every aspect of human life, including family and reproductive life, was to be socialized. The Nazi eugenics program had two faces, positive and negative. The positive face aimed at increasing the number of pure Aryan births, while the negative face aimed at eliminating the inferior genetic influences in Germany. In order to implement both sides of the program, the Nazis first needed to define racial purity. They decided that there were three races: full Jew, having 3 or more Jewish grandparents; 2 degrees of Mischlinge, or mixed types, having either 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents; and full Aryan, having no Jewish grandparents. The pure Aryan would be the tall, slender, yet strong, blonde human being. Naturally, this led to some serious parity, given that not many of the Nazi leadership met those criteria. Neither Goebbels, nor Goering, nor Hitler himself obviously met the criteria. All humor aside, the Nazis set about achieving the positive face of their program in several ways. They provided incentives to encourage racially pure marriages. Incentives included loans to help young married couples get established, subsidies for each child produced, and official awards such as this medal offered to hero mothers of 4 or more children. Childless couples were vilified. The Nazi government also lowered the age of marriage to 16. They encouraged the birth of illegitimate Aryan children. They outlawed abortion for Aryans. They strictly regulated birth control. They made it illegal for sterile women to get married, and initially they forbade mothers from working outside the home. Heinrich Himmler was in charge of this aspect of Nazi policy. Himmler was also the chief of the SS and of the Gestapo, making him one of the 2 or 3 most powerful Nazis in the regime. Under Himmler's direction, the Nazis created the Lebensborn program in 1935. The program established group homes for young Aryan women impregnated by Aryan men. After racial purity was established, the women were provided with lodging, food, and medical care. In return, they signed away the rights to their fetuses, who, upon birth, would be placed with good Nazi families. Between 12,000 and 16,000 children were born in Lebensborn homes in Nazi Germany and in Nazi-occupied territories. A few years later, in order to speed up the development of the pure Aryan race, the Nazis began to kidnap Aryan children in Nazi-occupied territories. An estimated 250,000 children ages 6 years and younger were taken back to Germany and assimilated into Nazi homes. The negative face of the Nazi eugenics program called for the elimination of non-Aryans. In 1935, the Nazis implemented the Nuremberg laws for the protection of hereditary health. The laws called for the forcible sterilization of individuals with mental or hereditary physical defects. In the 1930s, an estimated 400,000 individuals were sterilized. Certification of Aryan descent became a requirement for marriage. Interracial marriages were prohibited, and the remaining rights of Jews were revoked. The Nazis then turned to extermination. In May of 1935, the regime euthanized 12 mental patients at a hospital in Hadamar, Germany. The Nazi Interior Ministry then required that children under 3 years of age with congenital defects be registered with the state. Those deemed unfit were taken away from their homes for special treatment. Special treatment meant being given a lethal injection or simply starved to death. Cautious, however, of public scrutiny, the Nazi strategy was slowly to get the public accustomed to euthanization and extermination before turning their full attention to the Jews. The public justification for these deaths was not only the biological health of the state. The Nazis also offered a collectivist economic justification. If the health of the citizenry is the state's responsibility, then the state has a responsibility to allocate its resources wisely. If the state allocates funds for the care of the weak, then effectively the strong are sacrificed. But it is the strong who are the state's best assets. It is they who are the realization and future of the Volk. The state accordingly has a moral responsibility not to allocate resources to the weak. If the weak perish as nature intends, then the strong are enhanced and the health of the state is improved. And this brings us to Nazi economic policy. Through education and censorship, the Nazis attempted to socialize the German mind. Through public health measures and eugenics, the Nazis attempted to socialize the German body. A natural extension of both policies is to socialize German economic production. As would be expected by the socialist part of National Socialism, the guiding policy of Nazi economics was that all property belonged to the Volk, the people, and was to be used only for the good of the people. Just as one's body was no longer one's private possession, but rather only to be used for the good of the people, so too one's economic property was no longer one's private possession, but was to be used only with state permission and only for the good of the people. Upon coming to power, the Nazis nationalized all property owned by Jews, and in 1934 they passed a law allowing the expropriation of all property owned by communists. Another early policy given high priority by the Nazi government was the reorganizing of all German businesses into cartels. The argument here was that in contrast to the disorderliness and the selfishness of free market capitalism, organizing all businesses into cartels would increase efficiency and a sense of German unity. In July of 1933, membership in a cartel became compulsory for German businesses, and in 1934 the cartel structure was reorganized and placed firmly under the direction of the German government. By 1937, small businesses with a capitalization under $40,000 were dissolved by the state. Labor unions had also been dissolved, as had been the rights to strike and collective bargaining. Unemployment was dealt with by public works programs of road building and so on. All property and labor power was now either owned outright by the state or, if still in private hands, subject to almost total state control. Businesses were told by the state what to produce and in what quantities. Wages and prices were also set by the state. And if anyone complained, a commonly used Nazi slogan put them on the defensive: the public interest before self-interest. The argument was quite clear. You are no longer a private individual seeking profit or higher wages in a capitalist economy. You and your property belong to the German people in trust, and you have a duty to serve the public interest even if it involves a personal sacrifice. There's an important subpoint worth dwelling upon for a moment here, for there's a lively debate about just how committed to economic socialism the Nazis were. After all, they did not outright nationalize all German businesses as pure socialism would require. Rather, they did leave some important businesses in private hands. A 1935 official statement put the National Socialist policy this way: the power economy will not be run by the state, but by private entrepreneurs acting under their own free and unrestricted responsibility. The state limits itself to the function of control, which is, of course, all-inclusive. It further reserves the right of intervention in order to enforce the supremacy of considerations of public interest. Here, the issue about how socialist the Nazis were involves a judgment call about long-term principles and short-term pragmatism. Here's a related example. Obviously, the Nazis were committed to racism. They were racist through and through. But we could point out that they formed alliances with the Italians and the Japanese, neither of whom were Aryans racially. It would be a mistake to infer from those alliances that the Nazis weren't really racist. They were racist, but as a matter of short-term strategic principle and compromise, they were willing to form alliances with those whom they would otherwise despise. The Italians and the Japanese were powers, and so in the short run, it makes strategic sense to overlook the racial issue to form an alliance. The same holds for economic socialism. Allowing some major businesses to remain in private hands made sense pragmatically in the short run. The Nazis knew that they needed productive enterprises to fuel the economy and the war machine, so it would have been foolish to interfere too much with smoothly running enterprises. Additionally, the Nazi government knew that they could count on the German nationalism of many business owners to give the government what they wanted. And if push came to shove, the Nazi government knew that they could and did pass precise regulations to direct production as they saw fit anyways. So while the Nazi government imposed many regulations upon businesses, the Nazis also counted on and received much voluntary commitment and enthusiasm. Many business owners, managers, and workers believed in the cause and devoted their economic energies to it. They saw the personal sacrifices that were demanded of them as their duty, and they obediently and willingly bore those sacrifices for the good of the cause. As a result, from 1932 to 1936, Germany underwent an economic boom, lifting itself out of the stagnation of the 1920s and early 1930s. Unemployment fell from 6 million to 1 million. National production increased 102%, and national income doubled. By 1936, the same year the Germans hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin, Germany was again an economic powerhouse. A national vote was held in March of that year to gauge popular support for Hitler's regime. Adolf Hitler was the only name on the ballot, and voters had a choice to vote for Hitler or not. Now, as dubious as this vote is, the numbers do tell us something. 98.6% of the voting population voted, and of those who voted, 98.7% voted for Adolf Hitler. That means 44 million adult Germans expressed support for Hitler's regime, and only about 500,000 did not. The most important part of the new Germany was the military. On a historically unprecedented scale, the German economy became a war economy. In 1935, conscription had been reintroduced, and in 1936, Hermann Göring took over as Germany's economic minister. Under Göring's direction, Germany began to develop a total war economy in earnest. Up until this time, the remilitarization of Germany had been kept semi-secret and had been paid for out of funds confiscated from enemies of the state and from blocked foreign bank accounts. But under Göring's new leadership, the remilitarization of Germany came out into the open. Also, as promised as long ago as 1920 in the Nazi Party's founding political program, the Nazis initiated a strategy of geographical expansion. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland. Also in 1936, Hitler concluded an alliance with Mussolini and Italy, and he sent troops to Spain to support General Francisco Franco's authoritarian regime. There was no military response from France, England, or the other Allied powers. In 1938, Germany took over Austria. No shooting or violence was necessary. After the takeover, a plebiscite was held in which one could vote yes or no for Hitler. In Austria, 99.75% voted for Hitler. In Germany, 99.08% voted for Hitler. Hitler was actually somewhat angry that he received less support from the Germans than he did from the Austrians. Again, there was no military response from the Allies. They believed that Hitler was satisfied with his expansion to date, and they also believed him when he signed the so-called Munich Agreement, agreeing to no more expansion beyond the Sudetenland, then an important part of Czechoslovakia. As a result of Hitler's signing that agreement in 1938, Time magazine even named him its Man of the Year for 1938. Early in 1939, Germany took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Again, there was no response from the Western Allies. But on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and this time the Western Allies responded. World War II had officially begun, and the 20th century began its second great collision of incompatible philosophies of life, with the broadly liberal, individualistic, democratic, and capitalist nations of the Allied West against the authoritarian, collectivistic, and socialist Axis powers of the East. And at the end of the war, tens of millions more people would be dead. The Germans were steeled for war and well prepared physically and psychologically. They believed in Lebensraum, the rightness of Germany's expanding as much as necessary to acquire land and resources for survival. They believed in the rightness of reincorporating ethnic Germans now living in foreign lands. They believed that Germany had a moral mission, even a divine mission, to show the world to a brighter, more idealistic future and to destroy the tottering and depraved capitalist nations of the West. As Hitler put it at the beginning of the war, "What will be destroyed in this war is a capitalist clique that was and remains willing to annihilate millions of men for the sake of their despicable personal interests." And of course, the Germans had plans for the Jews. In 1821, the German poet Heinrich Heine said, "Where books are burned, in the end, people are also burned." Heine was evoking the terrible Reformation and Counter-Reformation era during which books and people were both regularly burned. But he was also making a philosophical point about the importance of ideas. Books are about ideas, and ideas matter. Human beings live what they believe, and if history teaches us anything, it's that human beings can believe an incredible variety of things about themselves and the world they live in. Books store and transmit ideas, but it's in the minds of actual human beings that ideas live and are put into practice. Burning a book has some stopping power for an idea, but the only way to eliminate fully an idea is to eliminate the individuals who believe it. Dictators know this, and they have no compunction about eliminating individuals. In this particular respect, then, the Nazis were not historically unique. They were unique in the unbelievable scale on which they operated and with the sheerly cold-blooded ruthlessness with which they destroyed, killed, and burned human beings. 11 to 12 million people were exterminated during the Holocaust. Approximately 6 million of them were Jews. We've all heard the numbers and the stories before, and it's hard sometimes for them not to become just abstract statistics in our minds. But just think of one person whom you know who lives a real life, loves his or her family, works hard, has dreams, a quirky sense of humor, wants to travel the world. And then imagine that person taken away in the middle of the night, herded into a cattle car, stripped naked, experimented upon without anesthesia, slowly starved, gassed, then shoved into an oven and burned to cinders. That is what the Nazis did to millions of actual human beings. All of the theoretical ingredients of the National Socialist program that contributed to the Holocaust were announced publicly 20 years before the Holocaust began. That human beings are divided into collective groups that give them their identity. That those collective groups are locked in a life and death competitive struggle. That any tactic is legitimate against one's collective enemies. That human beings are not individuals with their own lives to live, but rather are servants of the state. That the state should have total power over the bodies and minds of the individuals and to direct them in the public interest. That individuals should be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the group as defined by higher authority. And throughout the 1930s, the Nazis experimented with many of the practical techniques they would use during the Holocaust. Throughout the 1930s, millions were denied basic human rights of liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness as a matter of official state policy. Many of those deemed undesirable were forced to leave their homes and country. Those who stayed were subject to officially tolerated and officially sanctioned vandalism, beatings, and occasional murders. Some of those deemed unfit to reproduce had been sterilized. Some of those deemed unfit to live had been euthanized. And as early as 1933, concentration camps were opened north of Berlin at Oranienburg and in the south of Germany at Dachau. As the 1930s progressed, more concentration camps had been added. And of course, the vicious anti-Semitism of the Nazis and their sympathizers among millions of Germans was common knowledge and common practice. It is appropriate that the classically educated Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Culture, would express it most bluntly and clearly. Certainly the Jew is also a man, but the flea is also an animal. So I return to our early question: how could Nazism happen? We do not do ourselves any favors by not understanding Nazism thoroughly or by being satisfied with superficial explanations. It took a world war in the 20th century to stop National Socialism. That's brute force. But brute force does not change anyone's minds, and it does not eliminate the underlying problems. To use a crude analogy, if two neighbors are having an ongoing argument about a series of problems and one neighbor knocks the other neighbor unconscious, that ends the argument, but it does not solve their problems. The underlying problems that gave rise to the argument are still there, and they will resurface. The same holds for National Socialism and its underlying differences with liberal democracies. The liberal democracies were able to knock out the Nazis during World War II, though it was a close call, but the underlying arguments are still with us. The differences between National Socialism and liberal democracies are profound and involve entirely different philosophies of life. National Socialism was the product of a well-thought-out philosophy of life, the main elements of which were originated, crafted, and argued by philosophers and other intellectuals across many generations. The Nazi intellectuals were not lightweights, and we run the risk of underestimating our enemy if we dismiss their ideology as being attractive only to a few cranky weirdos. If your enemy has a machine gun, but you believe he only has a pea shooter, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And if we remind ourselves of the impressive credentials of many intellectuals who supported Nazism, Nobel Prize winners, outstanding philosophers, brilliant legal minds, then it is clear that these were no pea shooters and that we ourselves need heavyweight intellectual ammunition to defend ourselves. In the case of other major historical revolutions, we are more used to seeing the significance of philosophy. When we think, for example, of the communist revolutions in Russia and China, we naturally think back to the philosopher Karl Marx. When we think about the causes of the American Revolution, we naturally think back to the philosopher John Locke. But what philosophers can we name in thinking about the causes of National Socialism? Perhaps we're more reluctant to name names since that revolution went so horribly wrong. But sometimes naming names is crucial to get to the historical heart of the matter. And here, several names are contenders. Georg Hegel, Johann Fichte, even elements from Karl Marx, all 19th century German philosophers. But in connection with the Nazis, perhaps the biggest and most controversial name mentioned regularly is that of Friedrich Nietzsche. The Nazis often cited Friedrich Nietzsche as one of their philosophical precursors, and even though Nietzsche died 33 years before the Nazis came to power, references to Nietzsche crop up regularly in Nazi writings and other activities. Adolf Hitler had a bust of Friedrich Nietzsche in his study. In 1935, Hitler attended the funeral of Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth. In 1938, the Nazis erected a public monument to Nietzsche. And in 1943, Adolf Hitler gave a set of Nietzsche's writings as a gift to his fellow dictator, Benito Mussolini. Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, was also a great admirer of Friedrich Nietzsche. In his semi-autobiographical novel, Goebbels has the title character Michael die in a mining accident. Afterwards, among his belongings are found 3 books: the Bible, Goethe's Faust, and Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. So, who was Friedrich Nietzsche? That which does not kill us makes us stronger. Live dangerously. Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher famous for his worship of human potential and for encouraging individuals to seek great heights and make real their creative dreams. He's also famous for his absolute loathing of all things small, cowardly, mediocre. In his writings, we find a corresponding reverence for all things noble, great, heroic. He spoke directly and passionately to the best within each of us. Do not throw away the hero in your soul. Hold holy your highest hope. And for those of us who feel we have a creative spark that must be honored and nurtured, the noble soul has reverence for itself. One indication of the importance of Nietzsche is the pantheon of major 20th century intellectuals whom he influenced. He was an influence on Jean-Paul Sartre and Hermann Hesse, both of whom won Nobel Prizes for literature. He was an influence on thinkers as diverse in their outlooks as Ayn Rand and Michel Foucault. Rand's politics are classically liberal or broadly libertarian, while Foucault's are far left, including a stint in the French Communist Party. There's the striking fact that Nietzsche was an atheist, but he was an influence on Martin Buber, one of the 20th century's most widely read theologians. And while Nietzsche had harsh things to say about the Jews, as we will see, he was nonetheless admired by Chaim Weizmann, a leader of the Zionist movement and first president of Israel. So what is the attraction of Nietzsche? There is the exciting, sometimes scorching prose. Nietzsche was a stylist par excellence. There is the romanticism of life as a great, daring adventure. And of importance to intellectuals, there is the fundamentality and sheer audacity of some of the questions he raises about the human condition. According to his teachers and professors, the young Friedrich Nietzsche showed extraordinary intellectual promise. He was appointed professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland at the age of 24, which is unusually young for a professor. Even more unusually, he was appointed professor without having finished his doctoral degree, which was almost unheard of. As brilliant as Nietzsche was, though, he was not suited for academic life. By all accounts, he was a terrible lecturer, and he suffered from chronic health problems, which contributed to a general nervous collapse in 1870. From the mid-1870s on, he wandered about Europe alone and mostly lonely, surveying the cultural landscape. And when we take stock of the world in the late 19th century, what do we learn? God is dead. For thousands of years we have believed in religion, but in the modern world, religion has become a shadow of its former self. Nietzsche's dramatic phrase, God is dead, is meant to capture the shocking and personal quality of this revelation. For those of us raised religiously, religion personalized the world. It gave us the sense that the universe had a purpose, that we were part of a larger plan. It gave us the comfort that, despite appearances, we were all equal and cared for, and that upon death, instead of a cold grave, the possibility of a happily ever after ending awaits us. But we find it hard to believe that anymore. In the modern world, we have seen the dramatic rise of science, providing different, less comfortable answers to the questions that religion traditionally had a monopoly on. We have thrown off the shackles of feudalism with its unquestioning acceptance of authority and knowing our place. We're more individualistic and naturalistic in our thinking. But in historical time, all of this has happened very quickly in the span of a few centuries. For millennia, we believed in religion. But come the 19th century, even the average man has heard that religion may have reached the end of its road. For most of us, even the suggestion of this hints at a crisis. Imagine a 13-year-old who is awakened in the middle of the night to be told by strangers that both his parents have died. He is suddenly an orphan. For as long as he can remember, his parents have been presences in his life, looking after him and guiding him, sometimes firmly, but always a benevolent protection against a world he is not yet ready to handle on his own. Now they are gone, and ready or not, he is thrust into that world alone. How does the young teen handle that transition? Culturally, Nietzsche says, we are like that young teenager. For as long as we can remember, our society has relied upon God the Father to look after us, to be a benevolent and sometimes stern guiding force through a difficult world. But suddenly we are orphaned. We wake up one morning to discover in our heart of hearts that our naively childhood religious beliefs have withered. So now, whether we like it or not, a question creeps into our minds. How do we face the prospect of a world without God or religion? Well, says Nietzsche, In the 19th century, most of us do not face that question well. Most people avoid the issue, sensing that even to raise it would be to enter dangerous territory. They sense that the game is up for religion, but out of fear, they shut down their minds and will themselves to believe that God is still out there somewhere. Life without religion is too scary to contemplate, so they retreat to a safety zone of belief and repeat nervously the formulas they have learned about faith. Now, it is one thing, Nietzsche says, for a medieval peasant to have a simple-minded faith. But for us moderns, such a faith has a tinge of dishonesty about it. Slightly better to Nietzsche, but not much, are the socialists of the 19th century. Socialism is on the rise, and many socialists have thrown off the religion of their childhood, but only halfway. Most socialists will accept that God is dead, but then they are very concerned that the state take God's place and look after them. The mighty state will provide for us and tell us what to do and protect us against the mean people of the world. Think of it this way. The Judeo-Christian tradition says that this is a world of sin, in which the weak suffer at the hands of the strong, that we should all be selfless and serve God and others, especially the sick and the helpless, and that in a future ideal world, heaven, the lion will lay down with the lamb, and the inescapable power of God will bring salvation to the weak and judgment to the wicked. The Marxist socialist tradition says that this is a world of evil exploitation in which the strong take advantage of the weak, but that we should all be selfless and serve others, especially the needy, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and that the forces of history will necessarily bring about a future ideal world, eliminating all harsh competition, empowering the oppressed, and eliminating the evil exploiters. Both religion and socialism thus glorify weakness and need. Both recoil from the world as it actually is, tough, unequal, harsh. Both flee to an imaginary future realm where they can feel safe. Both say to you, be a nice boy, be a good little girl, share, feel sorry for the little people. And both desperately seek someone to look after them, whether it be God or the state. But where, asks Nietzsche, are the men of courage? Who is willing to stare into the abyss? Who can stand alone on an icy mountaintop? Who is willing to look a tiger in the eye without flinching? Such men exist. Every generation produces its occasional magnificent men, sparkling, vital men who accept easily that life is tough, unequal, unfair, and who welcome asserting their strength to meet the challenge. Those who have unbending wills against anything the world can throw at them. But such magnificent men are few and far between in the 19th century, and Nietzsche wonders why. And he looks back on past cultures where the magnificent men dominated. Strength was prized and inequality was a fact of life. Assertiveness and conquest were sources of pride. He names the Japanese feudal nobility as an example, with their samurai code of honor. The Indian Brahmins who rose up and imposed their caste system. The Vikings who raided ruthlessly up and down the European coast. The expansionist Arabs, and of course, the awesome Roman Empire. What explains this stark contrast? Why do some cultures rise to greatness and unabashedly impose their will upon the world, while other cultures seem apologetic and urge upon us a bland conformity? Part of the answer, says Nietzsche, is biological. All of organic nature is divided into two broad species types, those who are by nature herd animals and those who are by nature loners. Some animals are naturally prey and others are predators. Some are born to be sheep, field mice, or cows, while other animals are born wolves, hawks, or lions. Psychologically and physically, this line runs through the human species as well. Some of us are born fearful and inclined to join the herd, while others of us are born fearless and inclined to seek great lonely heights. Some of us are born sedentary and more sluggish, while others are born crackling with purpose and craving adventure. Some of us, to use Nietzsche's language, are born slaves, and others are born to be masters. And which type you are well, there's very little you can do about it. There's a brute biological fact here, Nietzsche believes. All of us are the product of a long evolutionary line, and our traits are bred into us evolutionarily. Just as a sheep cannot help but be sheepish, and a hawk cannot help but be hawkish, each of us inherits from our parents and from their parents before them a long line of inbuilt traits. It cannot be effaced from a man's soul what his ancestors have preferably and most constantly done. The master types live by strength, creativity, independence, assertiveness, and related traits. They respect power, courage, boldness, risk-taking, even recklessness. It's natural for them to follow their own path no matter what, to rebel against social pressure and conformity. The slave types live in conformity. They tend to passivity, dependence, meekness. It is natural for them to stick together for a sense of security, just as herd animals do. Now, says Nietzsche, let's talk about morality, about good and bad, right and wrong. For thousands of years, we've been taught that morality is a matter of religious commandments set in stone thousands of years ago. Not so, says Nietzsche. What we take to be moral depends on our biological natures, and different biological natures dictate different moral codes. Think of it this way. If you're a sheep, then what will seem good to you as a sheep? Well, being able to graze peacefully, sticking close together with others just like you, being part of the herd and not straying off. And what will seem bad to you? Well, wolves will seem bad, and anything wolf-like, predatory, or aggressive. But what if you're a wolf? Then strength, viciousness, and contempt for sheep will no doubt feel natural to you and good. There is nothing that the wolves and the sheep can agree upon morally. Their natures are different, as are their needs and their goals, as is what feels good to them. Of course, it would be good for the sheep if they could convince the wolves to be more sheep-like, but no self-respecting wolf is going to fall for that. That lambs dislike great birds of prey does not seem strange, only it gives no grounds for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. And if the lambs say among themselves, "These birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would he not be good?" There is no reason to find fault with this institution of an ideal, except perhaps that the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, "Well, we don't dislike them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. Nothing is more tasty than a tender lamb." The same point holds for humans. The divide between the strong and the weak, the assertive and the timid, runs right through the human species. So, says Nietzsche, the key question to ask about morality is not, is such and such a moral code universally and intrinsically good? Rather, the key question is, to what kind of person does such a moral code seem good? One's moral code is a decisive witness to who he is, to the innermost drives of his nature. Moral judgments, Nietzsche says, are symptoms and sign languages which betray the process of physiological prosperity or failure. So, one's moral code is a function of one's psychological makeup, and one's psychological makeup is a function of one's underlying biological makeup. The biological language and examples in the above quotations show that biology is central to Nietzsche's thinking about morality. Nietzsche was a precocious 15 years old when Charles Darwin's book On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. Of course, evolutionary ideas had been in the air a long time before Darwin, and much of the intellectual world was moving away from thinking about reality in terms of timeless, unchanging absolutes, and more toward thinking of reality in terms of process and change. And this applies to morality too. Moral codes, Nietzsche is suggesting, are part of a biological type's survival strategy. And the more you look at the history of morality evolutionarily and biologically, the more you are struck by the diversity of circumstances and how beliefs about moral codes have varied dramatically across time. And this is our key problem culturally, Nietzsche believes. The evidence shows that we used to prize excellence, strength, and power, and to look down upon the weak, the lowly, and the humble. Now, it's the humble, the common man, and the kindly neighbor who are the good guys, while the strong, the powerful, the excellent, the proud are evil. Think of it this way. Suppose I gave you the following list of traits and urged them upon you positively. It is good to be proud of yourself, to have a healthy sense of self-esteem. Wealth is good, for it gives you the power to live as you wish. Be ambitious and bold and seek your highest dream. Don't take any garbage from people. Make it clear that you will take vengeance and exact justice against those who mess with you. Seek to improve your life and devote yourself only to those things that will profit you. Don't waste your time or resources. Seek great challenges, great pleasures, including sensual pleasures of the body, and go your own independent way in life, embracing whatever risks you must take in order to develop a full and realized sense of yourself as an individual. And when you have accomplished something great, admire yourself for what you have done and indulge yourself in the rewards that greatness deserves. Now consider the elements of this list together in a package. Does that list resonate with you? Do you think that if people lived according to this list of traits, that they would lead fuller, more active lives, and that they and the human species would reach its highest potential? Now consider a different set of traits, and let me urge this list upon you positively too. One should be humble, for pride goeth before the fall. The meek shall inherit the earth, and blessed are the poor. As for wealth and the rich, it shall be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. Instead of seeking profit, one should sacrifice and give to charity. Be patient and forgiving. Turn the other cheek. Be aware of one's weaknesses and sins, and be ashamed and self-deprecating as a result of that. Practice self-restraint, particularly with respect to your lower, impure, and often disgusting physical desires. Play it safe. Think of other people's needs first, and don't rock the boat. Realize that we're all dependent upon one another. Obey your parents and your preacher and the politicians. Does the list on the right resonate with you? Do you think that if more people lived that way, they would live better lives and they and the human species would realize its highest potential? Nietzsche is crystal clear about the list on the right. That list is dangerous to human potential. It is a symptom of weakness, even of sickness and unhealthiness. It undermines the human potential for greatness, and it is, tragically, the dominant morality of our time. In our time, all of the traits that ennoble man are condemned, and all of the traits that weaken man are praised. Morality has become, as Nietzsche puts it paradoxically, a bad thing. Morality has become immoral. Precisely morality would be to blame if the highest power and splendor actually possible to the type man was never in fact attained, so that precisely morality was the danger of dangers. Accordingly, Nietzsche concludes, we need a critique of moral values. The value of these values themselves must first be called in question, and for that there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and circumstances in which they grew, under which they evolved and changed. Our problem is this. Somehow the morality of the weak has become dominant, and the morality of the strong has declined. How is this rather paradoxical state of affairs to be explained? Part of the story is individual, a matter of our individual biological and psychological makeups. For each of us individually, either the master morality or the slave morality resonates more deeply. But part of the story is also cultural, for sometimes in a culture the master morality dominates, and sometimes the slave morality dominates. And here Nietzsche says there's a history lesson. Part of the historical story is that the modern world has embraced democracy, and democracy means giving power to the majority. And the majority of people are, shall we say, conformist in their tastes, concerned with what their neighbors think about them, looking forward to retirement when they won't have to do anything, content to sit in their little homes gossiping and griping about their bosses and mothers-in-law. Democracies give power to that sort of person, so we should expect that democratic laws and policies will reflect the tastes and interests of that sort of person. Democracies tailor their policies to the majority, and not to the exceptional few, the radicals, the trailblazers, the uncompromising risk-takers. But Nietzsche believes that the modern movement to democracy is itself an effect of deeper historical causes. If we reflect again on the elements that were on the right side of the list, the slave morality list, pride goeth before the fall. Blessed are the meek, turn the other cheek, then clearly all of those elements come out of the Western religious traditions. Nietzsche is forthrightly blaming the Judeo-Christian moral tradition for the rise of the slave morality. For Nietzsche, there are no essential differences between Jews and Christians. Jesus was a Jew who wanted to reform Judaism, and the ensuing split between Judaism and Christianity is a matter of two variations on the same theme. Jews and Christians share the same roots, the same general approach to morality, and Nietzsche traces the origin of that morality back to a decisive event that occurred early in Jewish history, before the time of Moses. That event was the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt. If we recall our biblical history, the Jews were for a long time a slave people under powerful Egyptian masters. But at the same time, we also know that the Jews found a way to survive their enslavement. And while their former Egyptian masters have long since perished, the Jews have survived, spread across the globe, and found a way to keep their religion and culture alive despite often horrible adversity. How did the Jews do it? Here, Nietzsche says the Jews under slavery asked themselves some very practical and realistic questions about morality. If it is good to survive in this world, then what policies and actions will keep you alive? If you happen to be a slave in this world, then what policies and actions will keep you alive as a slave? What policies and actions, by contrast, are likely to get you killed? And if you are a slave who has children whom you desperately want to survive and see them grow up, then what will you teach your slave children about good behavior to increase their chances of actually doing so? Here, Nietzsche is saying that what is moral is not a matter of supernatural theological commandments that hold for all circumstances timelessly. Instead, what is moral is a matter of real-life practical circumstances, and different practical circumstances will call for different moral strategies. So, if you happen to be a slave, what strategy will be moral for you? That is to say, what morality will actually help you survive? If you are a slave, then you must obey the master. This does not come naturally. All living things, says Nietzsche, desire to express themselves. They want to express their power. So in order to obey the master, you must suppress your natural instinct and train yourself to become obedient. Or to take another example, suppose the master strikes you because you did something wrong. The desire for revenge arises naturally, but again you must suppress that desire and not act on it. You must train yourself and internalize obedience, forgiveness, patience, humility. Slaves who do not do this end up dead. Slaves who are proud, unforgiving, disobedient, impatient don't last long. Slave virtues thus have survival value. Slaves who internalize successfully humility, obedience, forgiveness, patience are the slaves who survive. And if you have children, those are the traits that you will drill into them if you want them to survive. Thus, slave virtues will become across generations cultural values. And so Nietzsche is concluding here that in this early decisive event in Jewish history, slave values became cultural values for the Jewish people. Notice that Nietzsche is saying that humility and obedience and so forth are moral not because some supernatural being commanded them to be so. Morality for Nietzsche has nothing to do with religion. Rather, those traits are moral because of down-to-earth, nitty-gritty, practical, how do I survive in a tough world of power struggles considerations. If you are a slave in such a world, then slave morality is a practical tool of survival. Now, of course, time passes and many people forget where their culture's moral code came from. Or they're passive and they don't think about it very much at all and simply accept the prevailing moral code. And even among slave peoples, there are many people who are sheep-like and don't especially mind being slaves. But others resent it, and here the story Nietzsche tells becomes darker. Some of those Jews who were living under Egyptian masters and later masters historically are human beings with a full human being's desire to live, to grow, and to express who they are. But as slaves, they cannot express it. To be a slave is to be frustrated constantly, and the more energetic and living you are, the greater your frustration. Such slaves will naturally start to resent their masters. And they will also start to hate themselves for having to do what the master says. How do you feel when your boss tells you to do something that you don't want to do? Do you tell your boss to take this job and shove it? Or do you knuckle under silently and do what he says, all the while resenting it? And if you knuckle under often enough and resent long enough, what does that begin to do to your soul? The pressure builds up. Not only do you start to hate the master, you start to hate yourself for being such a weakling and knuckling under. And that in turn causes unbearable pressure to build up inside, psychologically. And that is when psychologically ugly things start to happen. Nietzsche puts the point this way: the outward discharge was inhibited and turned backward against man himself. Hostility, cruelty, joy in persecuting, in attacking, in change, in destruction, all this turned against the possessors of such instincts. That is the origin of the bad conscience. So if you are one of those who has this bad conscience, how do you console yourself? How do you not descend into a self-destructive rage? How do you channel all of that pent-up energy and frustration in a safe direction that nonetheless lets you feel good about yourself? You cannot take real revenge against the masters. You don't have the strength for that. But what about fantasy revenge? Here Nietzsche asks us to think about priests, those who are not your usual sheep-like followers of a religion, but who are cleverer, who are more ambitious and driven in their religion, and who feel more acutely the internal struggle between the natural animal drive for power and the demands of a morality that has taught them to be selfless and humble. Inside such priests, Nietzsche says, we find the most interesting and disturbing psychological phenomena. Nietzsche puts the point harshly. It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions. The truly great haters in world history have always been priests. And what are the priests of the Judeo-Christian tradition constantly talking about? Isn't it one big revenge fantasy? Such priests regularly tell their flock that it is good to be humble, meek, and obedient. But to whom is one to be obedient? Well, of course, one is to be obedient to God, but God is not often around. So in practical terms, being obedient to God means being obedient to God's representatives here on earth. And guess who they are? That is, of course, the priests. So this is one part of the strategy. Form a power base of a large number of people who are your obedient followers. You might not have the quality people on your side, but sometimes having a large quantity of people can be a powerful weapon. Another part of the sermon is to condemn those who are rich, powerful, and assertive, to demand that they give their money away to the poor, that they use their power on behalf of the weak and the sick, that they be like the lion that is to lay down with the lamb and not to eat it for lunch. But what is the point of all of these sermons against the rich and the powerful? Well, part of it is to give a consolation to those in your audience who are poor and weak. It plays on their natural envy of those who are rich and strong, and it gives them a satisfaction at hearing the rich and strong getting a tongue lashing. But the sermon is also meant as a direct weapon against the strong and the powerful, and it is meant to induce in them a sense of guilt and self-doubt about who they are and how they live. The moral sermon is a psychological weapon that the weak use in their battle against the strong, and of course the weak use a psychological weapon because physical weapons are not their forte. The priests never use physical confrontation against the masters, and the masters find it beneath their dignity to fight against an unarmed and to them contemptible enemy. Instead, the priests use morality as their weapon of confrontation. They praise the meek and condemn the strong. Judeo-Christian ethics, Nietzsche says, has waged deadly war against this higher type of man. It has placed all the basic instincts of his type under ban. The Judeo-Christian moral code, Nietzsche concludes, becomes part of their revenge strategy. Its point is to help the weaker survive in a harsh world in which they are often on the receiving end of the big stick. But its point is also to undermine the master type's confidence in themselves, to subdue them and eventually to bring them down so as to exact a spiritual revenge. As evidence of this, Nietzsche reminds us of standard Judeo-Christian rhetoric about how, despite appearances, the poor, the sick, and the meek will triumph in the end. Their kingdom will come, and God will visit his wrath upon the rich and the powerful. And in a perfect catch, Nietzsche here quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, patron saint of Catholic theology and the most influential Christian philosopher of the last millennium. In order that the bliss of the saints may be more delightful for them, and that they may render more copious thanks to God for it, it is given to them to see perfectly the punishment of the damned. So boiling all of this down to two essential points, Nietzsche believes that the slave morality of the Judeo-Christian tradition is part of a twofold strategy. On the one hand, it is a survival code that enables the weak to band together for mutual support. And more sinisterly, it is part of a revenge and a power play in their ongoing battle against the strong. And in Nietzsche's judgment, there is no serious question about who is winning this age-old battle. An early Christian church father named Tertullian once asked rhetorically, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" In early church history, Christians such as Tertullian were often argued with and even mocked by philosophers coming out of the pagan schools of classical Greek philosophy. The point of Tertullian's reply, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" was that the traditions that came out of Athens and the tradition that came out of Jerusalem were opposed and have nothing to do with one another. They are part of an ongoing battle for dominance of the soul of the Western world. Nietzsche agrees, but he phrases the point differently. Jerusalem is the home of the major Western religious traditions, all of them stemming from Judaism. But instead of Athens, Nietzsche points to Rome as the greatest height the pagan traditions achieved. In Rome, the philosophy and the art of the Greeks combined with the political and military genius of the Romans to create the greatest empire the world had ever seen. So in Nietzsche's reading of history, the great battle for the soul of the Western world is Rome versus Judea. And as evidence of whether Rome or Judea is winning, Nietzsche asks us to consider to whom one kneels down before in Rome today. The Judeo-Christians have taken over Rome, and to use Nietzsche's words, everything visibly is becoming Judaized, Christianized, mobized. The chief slave has for a long time established his camp and planted his flag right in the center of what was the greatest master empire the world had ever seen. All of this is a great moral crisis, Nietzsche urges us to think, for the future development of mankind is at stake. What kind of species do we want to be? In what ways do we want to develop? The moral code we choose will set our course. What most people see as the only morality possible, Judeo-Christian morality, Nietzsche sees as a threat to human development. For that morality damns the traits of assertiveness and egoism and independence and risk-taking that make human development and greatness possible. And that same morality praises smallness and meekness and falling on your knees in shame, all traits that undermine human greatness. Nothing stands more malignantly in the way of mankind's rise and evolution than what in Europe today is called simply morality. So the current dominance of the Judeo-Christian moral code is an unhealthy development that must be overcome. The fate of the human species depends on it. We must go beyond good and evil. Nietzsche once said that he philosophized with a hammer. By that he did not mean anything crude like a sledgehammer that smashes things. He had in mind a delicate hammer, like the one a piano tuner uses to strike keys on a finely built musical instrument, to see which notes are clear and which notes are discordant or muddy. In writing his philosophy, Nietzsche intends for his words to be like that delicate hammer on your soul. When you read them or hear them, how does your soul respond? Does it vibrate clearly, or does it wobble uncertainly? When you hear that God is dead, do those words cause you to shrink inside and fill with a squishy panic? Or do those words strike a clear, pure, liberating note that heralds the beginning of the magnificent symphony you can become? God is dead, so we must become gods ourselves and create a new set of values. Yet, Nietzsche says, most people are afraid to legislate for themselves. They know there is great risk and much inequality out there in the big bad world, so they want a higher power to shoulder the responsibility. But, Nietzsche says, for some precious few among us, The revelation that God is dead galvanizes every fiber of their being. They respond by feeling passionately and solemnly, I will become the author. I will create. I will accept the responsibility joyously. I will move beyond good and evil and create a new, magnificent set of values. Such an individual will elevate mankind to a higher level of being. He will be the Übermensch, the Superman, or the Overman. The entire history of mankind, Nietzsche believes, will have prepared the Übermensch for his great creative adventure. In himself, he will embody the best of the past. The exuberance and physical vitality of the past masters will flow through his veins. But Nietzsche also credits the Judeo-Christian tradition for its internalized spiritual development by turning all of its energy inward and stressing ruthless self-discipline and self-denial. That tradition has been the vehicle for the creation of a stronger, more capable type of spirit. The new masters will thus combine the physical vitality of the aristocratic masters of old with the spiritual ruthlessness of the slave priests of Christianity. As Nietzsche put it in one memorable phrase, the new masters will be Caesars with the soul of Christ. We cannot say ahead of time what new values the Overman will create. Not being Overmen ourselves, we cannot legislate for him or even predict what he will decide. But Nietzsche does indicate fairly strongly what broad direction he thinks the Overman will take. The Overman will find his deepest instinct and let it be a tyrant. The creative source of the future lies in instinct, passion, will. To put the point negatively, the Overman will not rely too much on reason. Reason, of course, is the favorite tool of modern scientific man, but Nietzsche holds that reason is a tool of weaklings, a superficial, fantasy-creating structure for those who need to feel safe and secure. Instead, Nietzsche believes instinct is the deepest part of your nature. And if you feel you have a strong, powerful instinct deep inside you, you should nurture it and let it dominate, for that is the source of true creativity. One thing is needful: to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. In the end, when the work is finished, it becomes evident how the constraint of a single taste governed and formed everything, large and small. Whether this taste was good or bad is less important than one might suppose, if only it was a single taste. And again, the great man is great owing to the free play and scope of his desires, and to the yet greater power that knows how to press these magnificent monsters into service. Another hint that Nietzsche gives us is that the Overman will accept conflict and exploitation easily, and he will enter the fray eagerly. In the face of conflict, many people are squeamish and given to wishing that life could be kinder and gentler. For such people, Nietzsche has nothing but contempt. People now rave everywhere, even under the guise of science, about the coming conditions of society in which the exploiting character is to be absent. That sounds to my ear as if they promise to invent a mode of life which should refrain from all organic functions. Conflict and exploitation are built into life, and the Overman will not only accept that as a natural fact, he will be a master of conflict and exploitation. As Nietzsche puts it, we think that everything evil, terrible, tyrannical in man, everything in him that is kin to beasts of prey and serpents, serves the enhancement of the species man as much as its opposite does. And further, a higher and more fundamental value for life might have to be ascribed to deception, selfishness, and lust. Another suggestion Nietzsche gives us about the Overman is this: the Overman will accept the natural fact of great inequalities among men and his own superiority. The Overman will have no qualms about his superior abilities and his superior worth to all others. About the superior men, Nietzsche forthrightly exclaims, "Every enhancement of the type man has so far been the work of an aristocratic society, and it will be so again and again. A society that believes in the long order of rank and differences in value between man, and that needs slavery in some sense or other." And as the last quotation suggests, Nietzsche indicates approvingly that the Overman will have absolutely no problem with using and exploiting ruthlessly others to achieve his ends. Mankind in the mass sacrificed to the prosperity of a single stronger species of man. That would be an advance. Nietzsche gives a name to his anticipated Overman. He calls him Zarathustra, and he titles his greatest literary and philosophical work after him. Zarathustra will be the creative tyrant. Having mastered himself and others, he will energetically and exuberantly create a magnificent new reality. Zarathustra will lead mankind beyond themselves and into an open-ended future. Nietzsche longs for Zarathustra's coming. But someday, in a stronger age than this decaying, self-doubting present, he must yet come to us, the redeeming man of great love and contempt, this man of the future who will redeem us not only from the hitherto reigning ideal, but also from that which was bound to grow out of it, the great nausea, the will to nothingness, nihilism. This Antichrist and anti-nihilist, this victor over God and nothingness, he must come one day. And on that prophetic note, Friedrich Nietzsche stops and leaves the future in our hands. So now we can ask the big payoff question. After surveying National Socialist theory and practice and engaging with Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, we can ask, to what extent were the Nazis justified in seeing Friedrich Nietzsche as a precursor of their movement? We know that Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, most of the major intellectuals of National Socialism, that they were great admirers of Nietzsche's philosophy, that they read him avidly during their formative years, recommended him to their friends, and incorporated sayings and themes from Nietzsche's writings into their own writings, speeches, and policies. To what extent were they justified in doing so? In my judgment on this complicated question, a split decision is called for. In some very important respects, the Nazis were perfectly justified in seeing Nietzsche as a forerunner and as an intellectual ally. And in some other important respects, Nietzsche would properly have been horrified at the misuse of his philosophy by the Nazis. Let's start with the key differences between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and here I want to single out 5 important points. Take the phrase, the blonde beast. In recoiling from what he saw as a flaccid 19th century European culture, Nietzsche often longingly called for some pack of blonde beasts of prey, a conqueror and master race which, organized for war and with the ability to organize, unhesitatingly lays its terrible claws upon a populace. And he spoke of the deep and icy mistrust the German still arouses today whenever he gets into a position of power, is an echo of that inextinguishable horror with which Europe observed for centuries that raging of the blonde Germanic beast. And again, inspirationally, about what one finds at the bottom of all these noble races, the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast prowling about avidly in search of spoil and victory. This hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out again and go back to the wilderness. What are we to make of these regular positive mentions of the blonde beast? It's clear what the Nazis made of them, an endorsement by Nietzsche of the superiority of the German Aryan type. But for those who've read the original Nietzsche, it's clear that that interpretation takes Nietzsche's words out of context. In context, the blonde beast that Nietzsche refers to is the lion, the great feline predator of the shaggy blonde mane and the terrific roar. Nietzsche does believe that the Germans once, a long time ago, manifested the spirit of the lion, but they were not unique in that regard. The power and spirit of the lion have been manifested by peoples of many races. Let's put one of the quotations in full context to see this. A moment ago I quoted this line to you. At the bottom of all these noble races, the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast prowling about avidly in search of spoil and victory, this hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out again and go back to the wilderness. Now let's complete the sentence as Nietzsche wrote it. The Roman, Arabian, Germanic, Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, the Scandinavian Vikings, they all shared this need. So Nietzsche is clearly using the lion analogically and is comparing its predatory power with the predatory power that many races have manifested. Here he lists 6 different races and ethnic groupings, and the Germans are not special or unique on that list. So while Nietzsche does advocate a biological basis for culture, he does not endorse a racism in the sense of holding that any one race is necessarily superior to any other. And this is a clear difference with the Nazis. The Nazis were racist and thought of the Germanic racial type as superior to all others the world over. Nietzsche disagreed. In fact, this leads us to a second major difference. While the Nazis put the German Aryan type first, Nietzsche is almost never complimentary about his fellow Germans. In Nietzsche's view, Germany has slipped into flabbiness and whininess. While the Germans once, long ago, were something to be awed and feared, 19th century Germany has become a nation of religious revivalism, socialism, of movements toward equality and democracy. Whatever special endowments the Germans once possessed, contemporary Germany has lost. Nietzsche makes this clear when speaking about the Germany of the 19th century. Between the old Germanic tribes and us Germans, there exists hardly a conceptual relationship, let alone one of blood. So rather than feeling proud of their ancient history and accomplishments, Nietzsche believes the Germans of his day should feel ashamed by comparison. At the same time, German intellectual and cultural life is prominent the world over, and Nietzsche deplores that fact. Germany of the 19th century is a center of softness and decay, so Germany's weaknesses, in his view, are infecting the rest of the world. As he puts it in a work entitled The Will to Power, Aryan influence has corrupted all the world. So rather than celebrating contemporary Germany and its power as the Nazis would do, Nietzsche is disgusted by contemporary Germany. And this leads us to a third major point of difference. The most disgusting sign of Germany's decline, Nietzsche writes, and this may surprise you, is its hatred of the Jews, its virulent and almost irrational anti-Semitism. Now, Nietzsche himself has said some harsh things about the Jews, but again, this is a set of issues that are easily misinterpreted, so we must be careful. In addition to all of the negative things that Nietzsche said about the Jews, we must also note the following. Nietzsche speaks of the anti-Jewish stupidity of the Germans. He speaks of those psychologically disturbed individuals who are most consumed with self-hatred and envy. He uses the French word ressentiment to describe such nauseating individuals, and says that such ressentiment is studied most easily in anarchists and anti-Semites. Pathological dishonesty is a symptom of such repulsive characters. An anti-Semite certainly is not any more decent because he lies as a matter of principle. So Nietzsche saves some of his most condemnatory language for Germans who hate Jews. He considers them to be liars, stupid, disturbed, self-hating pathological cases for psychologists with strong stomachs to study. So it seems a reasonable inference that Nietzsche would have been disgusted by the Nazis, for the Nazis incorporated into their ideology the worst possible kind of anti-Semitism and pursued their anti-Jew policies almost to the point of self-destruction. But how does this fit with all of the harsh things that we know Nietzsche said about the Jews? This brings us to a fourth major difference between Nietzsche and the Nazis. For all of the negative things that Nietzsche says about the Jews, he also respects them and gives them high praise. Here's a representative quotation from Beyond Good and Evil. The Jews, however, are beyond any doubt the strongest, toughest, and purest race now living in Europe. Here is another from a work called The Antichrist. Psychologically considered, the Jewish people are a people endowed with the toughest vital energy, who, placed in impossible circumstances, divined a power in these instincts with which one could prevail against the world. He again praises the Jews for having the strength to rule Europe if they chose to. That the Jews, if they wanted it, or if they were forced into it, which seems to be what the anti-Semites want, could even now have preponderance, indeed quite literally mastery over Europe, that is certain. That they are not working and planning for it, that is equally certain. And in another work, Nietzsche compares the Jews favorably to the Germans. In fact, he identifies a way in which the Jews are superior to the Germans. Europe owes the Jews no small thanks for making its people more logical, for cleaner intellectual habits, none more so than the Germans, a lamentably déraisonnable race that even today first needs to be given a good mental drubbing. But how can all of this praise of the Jews fit with the rest of what Nietzsche has said about them? One important distinction here is between blaming the Jews of several millennia ago for developing the slave morality and foisting it upon the world, and between evaluating the Jews of today as inheritors of a cultural tradition that has enabled them to survive and even flourish, often despite great adversity. In the former case, Nietzsche assigns blame to the Jews and condemns them for subverting the potential for human greatness. But in the latter case, he would have to grant, at the very least, however grudgingly, that the Jews have hit upon a survival strategy that has enabled them to keep their cultural traditions intact for well over 2,000 years. How many other cultures can make that claim? The list is very short, and for that, the Jews deserve praise. One more key difference between Nietzsche and the Nazis is important, and that is their views on Christianity. Nietzsche consistently states that Judaism and Christianity are allies, both stemming from the same source, both advocating a religious morality that puts the weak, the sick, and the humble first. As with Judaism, Christian morality is slave morality. Christianity, he writes, is a rebellion of everything that crawls on the ground against that which has height. The Christians, he writes, did not know how to love their God except by crucifying man. And for that great crime against humanity, Nietzsche says, I condemn Christianity. I raise against the Christian church the most terrible of all accusations that any accuser ever uttered. It is to me the highest of all conceivable corruptions. So Christianity did not escape Nietzsche's wrath, just as Judaism did not escape Nietzsche's wrath, and for the same reasons. Christianity is an extension and a purification of moral themes first developed within Judaism. In Nietzsche's own words, in Christianity, all of Judaism attains its ultimate mastery as the art of lying in a holy manner. The Christian, the ultima ratio of the lie, is the Jew once more, even 3 times more. This identification of Christianity with Judaism also separates Nietzsche from the Nazis, for the Nazis took great pains to separate Jews and Christians, condemning Judaism and embracing a generic type of Christianity. Early in the Nazi Party's history, in its 1920 founding political document, the party program, point number 24 states the following. The party as such stands for positive Christianity, without, however, allying itself to any particular denomination. It combats the Jewish materialistic spirit. The use of Christian themes and imagery was prominent in Nazi propaganda throughout the 1920s. Recall this political poster with the Christian spiritual figure embracing the German soldier. In Joseph Goebbels' semi-autobiographical novel, Michael, the main character is portrayed as a hybrid Christ figure in German martyr. And in a 1935 interview, Goebbels was so concerned to separate Christianity from Judaism that he went as far as to deny that Jesus was a Jew. Adolf Hitler himself often used Christian moral imagery and themes in public pronouncements such as the following. When I came to Berlin a few weeks ago, the luxury, the perversion, the iniquity, the wanton display, and the Jewish materialism disgusted me so thoroughly that I was almost beside myself. I nearly imagined myself to be Jesus Christ when he came to his Father's temple and found it taken by the money changers. I can well imagine how he felt when he seized a whip and scourged them out. So to summarize, we have 5 significant partings of the ways between Nietzsche and the Nazis. First, the Nazis believed the German Aryan to be racially superior, while Nietzsche believes that the superior types can be manifested in any racial type. Second, the Nazis believed contemporary German culture to be the highest and best hope for the world, while Nietzsche holds contemporary German culture to be degenerate and to be infecting the rest of the world. Third, the Nazis are enthusiastically anti-Semitic, while Nietzsche sees anti-Semitism to be a moral sickness. Fourth, the Nazis hate all things Jewish, while Nietzsche praises the Jews for their toughness, their intelligence, and their sheer survival ability. Fifth, and finally, the Nazis see Christianity to be radically different from and much superior to Judaism, while Nietzsche believes Judaism and Christianity to be essentially the same, with Christianity being in fact a worse and more dangerous variation of Judaism. Those strike me as important differences and to lend support to those interpreters of Nietzsche who complain about simple identifications of Nietzsche as a proto-Nazi philosopher. But there are equally important ways in which the Nazis were right on target in seeing Nietzsche as an intellectual ally. We know that the National Socialists were anti-individualistic and collectivistic. For them, the relevant groups were the Aryan Germans and everyone else. Individuals were defined by the groups to which they belonged, and individuals were seen only as vehicles through which groups achieved their interests. The Nazis rejected the Western liberal idea that individuals were ends in themselves. To the Nazis, individuals were servants of the groups to which they belonged. The anti-individualism of the Nazis was most blatant in their treatment of Jews. They did not see Jews as individuals with moral rights and significance. They saw only members of a group that they wished to destroy. This meant as a matter of policy that the Nazis were uncaring about the lives of individuals, and that they were willing to destroy as many individuals' lives as was necessary to achieve their group's advantage. Even within their own group, the Nazis did not see the German Aryans fundamentally as individuals. They saw them as members of the Volk, the German people, the group to which they owed service, obedience, and even their lives. Nietzsche has a reputation for being an individualist. There are individualist elements in Nietzsche's philosophy, but in my judgment, his reputation for individualism is often much overstated. When we speak of philosophies as being individualist or collectivist, 3 key points are at issue. First, we ask, do individuals shape their own identities, or are their identities created by forces beyond their control? Do individuals have the capacity to decide their own beliefs, to form their own characters? Or is their identity fundamentally a matter of their biological inheritance, or shaped by the cultural groups in which they are born and raised? Second, we ask, are individuals ends in themselves with their own lives and purposes to pursue? Or do individuals exist for the sake of something beyond themselves, to which they are expected to subordinate their interests? Third, we ask, do the decisive events in human life and history happen because individuals, often exceptional individuals, make them happen? Or do the decisive events in history result from collective action or from there being larger forces at work? Let's take the first issue, whether individuals shape themselves significantly or whether they're a product of forces beyond their control. Only in an attenuated way does Nietzsche think that individuals shape their characters or destinies. To a great extent, he is a determinist, believing that individuals are a product of their biological heritage. As he puts it in Beyond Good and Evil, One cannot erase from the soul of a human being what his ancestors liked most to do and did most constantly. Any given individual's thoughts, feelings, and actions are the expression of an underlying set of traits that the individual inherited. Whether one is a sheep or a wolf is a matter of biology. One does not choose or shape oneself significantly. So to that extent, it does not make sense to hold individuals responsible for who they are or what they become. What about the second issue? Does Nietzsche believe that individuals are ends in themselves, that they exist for their own sake? Emphatically not. Here's where I think many casual readings of Nietzsche get him dead wrong. Take an obvious point. Nietzsche has nothing but contempt for the vast majority of the human population, believing them to be sheep who are a disgrace to the dignity of the human species. Their individual lives have no value in themselves. This is Nietzsche's point in the following quotation, where he explicitly denies that his philosophy is individualistic. My philosophy aims at an ordering of rank, not at an individualistic morality. Nietzsche believes that most individuals have no right to exist, and more brutally, that if they were sacrificed or even slaughtered, that would be an improvement. In Nietzsche's own words, mankind in the mass sacrificed to the prosperity of a single stronger species of man, that would be an advance. And again, one must learn from war. One must learn to sacrifice many and to take one's cause seriously enough not to spare men. It is hard to see as an individualist anyone who sees no value at all in the lives of the vast majority of individuals. And it is hard to see as an individualist anyone who would sacrifice those individuals in the name of improving the species. Improving the species is a collectivistic goal. And measuring the value of individuals in terms of their value to the species and sacrificing those that don't measure up, that is textbook collectivism. This connects directly to the value that Nietzsche sees in the few great individuals who crop up in each generation. It is his powerfully poetic rhetoric about those exceptional individuals that gives Nietzsche his reputation for being an individualist. But it is important to note here that Nietzsche does not see even those exceptional individuals as ends in themselves, and he does not exempt them from the sacrifice. The point of becoming an exceptional individual is not to advance one's own life and interests. It is to improve the human species. In fact, to get beyond the human species to a higher species type, the overman. As Nietzsche says repeatedly, not mankind, but overman is the goal. Nietzsche's goal is a collectivist one, to bring about a new, future, higher species type, the overman. This is the significance of his exhortations about the Übermensch, the superman or overman. So none of us, whether weak or strong, exists for our own sake. In contrast to individualists who believe that individuals' lives are their own to find and create meaning within, Nietzsche believes that individuals have value only to the extent that they fulfill a collectivist end beyond their lives, the creation of a stronger species. And on that general collectivist end, Nietzsche shares an important point in common with the Nazis. There's also the third sub-issue of individualism, whether the decisive events in human life and history happen because individuals, generally exceptional individuals, make them happen, or whether individuals are pawns of larger forces. Here the Nazis were a combination of both parts. They believed in and utilized mass movement politics. They saw their political movement as a vehicle through which a powerful cultural force, the German Volk, was asserting its historical destiny. At the same time, the Nazis believed that those powerful historical forces singled out special individuals to perform special tasks, and that destiny spoke through those special individuals. This, at any rate, was Hitler's firm belief when he made statements such as the following: I carry out the commands that Providence has laid upon me, and no power on earth can shake the German Reich now. Divine Providence has willed it that I carry through the fulfillment of the Germanic task. In invoking divine providence, Hitler is drawing upon a long philosophical tradition that goes back most famously to Georg Hegel, an early 19th century German philosopher with his world historical individuals. Those individuals such as Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte, who, on Hegel's view, were vehicles through which the spiritual forces of history operated. And that tradition goes back even further in most religious interpretations of history. Think, for example, of religious prophets. Prophets are special individuals within a religious tradition. Yet, a prophet is not special as an individual. He's not an individual who has acquired his powers through his own efforts, and he is not someone who has created his own new and unique vision. Rather, the prophet is special only because God has chosen him and is speaking through him. The prophet is totally a tool. It is God who works through him, and he is a mouthpiece for God's message. The prophet is a localized vehicle through which the real force, God, works. Now let's return to Nietzsche. Nietzsche is an atheist, but he offers a secular and somewhat watered-down version of the same theory. Nietzsche's powerful force is not spiritual or religious, but biological. His special individuals, great prophets such as Zarathustra, are individuals in whom powerful evolutionary forces have converged to create something remarkable. And those powerful forces are operating through the Zarathustras to create something even more remarkable, the Overman. The Zarathustras do not develop and use power. Rather, power develops them and uses them. They are only the tools, the vehicles through which power operates. This is what Nietzsche means in quotations such as the following. Every living creature values many things higher than life itself. Yet out of this evaluation itself speaks the will to power. The will to power works through those individuals. It's not that those individuals develop and use power. There's legitimate controversy among scholars over this interpretation of Nietzsche, but to the extent that it is true, it does undermine Nietzsche's reputation as an individualist, and it does lend support to the claim that the Nazis have on Nietzsche as a philosophical forerunner. A second major point of agreement between Nietzsche and the Nazis is their view of conflict. For both, conflict is the fundamental human reality, and both believe firmly that life is a matter of some individuals and groups advancing their interests at the expense of others. The Nazis were clear about this in theory and practice. They did not believe it possible for Aryans and Jews to live together in harmony. Nor did the Nazis think it possible for Germany to live harmoniously with the liberal capitalist nations of the West. In those liberal capitalist nations, by contrast, many economists and politicians had come to believe that the productive power of the Industrial Revolution led to surpluses, and surpluses led to trade between nations that was mutually beneficial. Trade, they thought, was a powerful harmonizing force. The Nazis, by contrast, rejected that view entirely and believed that recent economic history was a matter of the Jews and the capitalists advancing their interests at the expense of Germany. Nietzsche shares with the Nazis the general point about zero-sum conflict. In his words, "The well-being of the majority and the well-being of the few are opposite viewpoints of value." But even more strongly, he does not believe that this conflict is merely a matter of historical and cultural accident, but is built into the requirements of life. Here one must think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. The horse eats the grass, the lion kills the horse, the man rides the horse and kills the lion. Life is an ongoing struggle between strong and weak, predator and prey. Cooperation and trade are possible, but they are superficial interludes between more fundamental animal facts about life. As Nietzsche again puts it, life always lives at the expense of other life. He who does not grasp this has not taken even the first step toward honesty with himself. On this point, Nietzsche and the Nazis agree. Now, given that the conflict is fundamental and inescapable, the next question to ask is, how will the conflicts be resolved? Hitler was fond of saying in private, "What luck that men do not think." Another significant point of agreement exists between Nietzsche and the Nazis. Both agree that the great conflicts will not be solved rationally through a process of discussion, argument, persuasion, and diplomacy. Both Nietzsche and the Nazis were strong irrationalists in their view of human psychology, and this has important social and political implications. Think about democracy for a moment. In particular, think about how much confidence in the power of reason that democracies require. Democracy is a matter of decentralizing political power, giving each individual a vote. The assumption of democracies is that individuals have the ability to weigh and judge important matters and to cast responsible votes. The expectation of democracies is that individuals will have ongoing discussions about a great many matters, that they will be able to assess the evidence, the arguments, and the counter-arguments. It's also expected that they will be able to learn from their mistakes and, when appropriate, to change their votes the next time around. It's not an accident that neither Nietzsche nor the Nazis was an advocate of either democracy or of reason. Hitler in particular believed that a highly developed intellect was a weakness and that too much reliance on reason was a sickness. He believed that Germany's recent problems stemmed from too much thinking. The intellect has grown autocratic and has become a disease of life. What Germany required was passion, a storm of emotion arising from deeply rooted instincts and drives. Only a storm of glowing passion can turn the destinies of nations, but this passion can only be roused by a man who carries it within himself. So German training and propaganda were not directed to presenting facts and arguments, but rather to inflaming the passions of the masses. Reason, logic, and objectivity were beside the point. "We are not objective, we are German," said Hans Schemm, the first Nazi minister of culture. Here again, there is a connection to Nietzsche. Nietzsche too sees an opposition between conscious reason and unconscious instinct, and he disparages those who stress rationality, or those who engage in what he calls the ridiculous overestimation and misunderstanding of consciousness. In his own words, it is rationality against instinct. And rationality is the least useful guiding power that humans possess. Humans came out of a long evolutionary line that relied on drives and instincts, and those drives and instincts served us well for millennia. However, humans eventually became settled, tamed, and civilized, and in Nietzsche's view, they lost something crucial. In this new world, they no longer possessed their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. They were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect, these unfortunate creatures. They were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ. Note that Nietzsche says our unconscious drives are infallible, if only we can find them within ourselves again. It is our strongest, most assertive unconscious drives we should let rule our lives. Instinct is, of all the kinds of intelligence that have been discovered so far, the most intelligent. And on this point, Nietzsche and the Nazis are in agreement. Both are fundamentally irrationalists. They do not think much of the power of reason, and they urge themselves and others to let their strongest passions and instincts well up within them and be released upon the world. Now put the three above points together: collectivism, conflict, and irrationalism. What will the social result be? If you believe wholeheartedly and passionately that your identity is found by merging yourself into your group, that your group is locked in a mortal zero-sum conflict with other groups, that reason is a superficial force and that instinct and passion drive the world, how will you conduct yourself and assert yourself in that conflict? For much of the 19th century, Western liberal capitalists had started to wonder whether war was a thing of the past. In their judgment, progress had been made. During the Enlightenment of the 18th century, much of the West embraced the idea that individuals have rights, rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. In the 19th century, those rights had been extended in practice to women, and slavery had been eliminated. Also in the 19th century came the full realization of the power of the Industrial Revolution and the idea that through technology and capitalism, economic production could be increased dramatically. As a result, the liberal capitalists of the 19th century came to believe that poverty was a problem that could be solved, and that we could eliminate most of our conflicts over wealth. They believed that with rising wealth and education, rational people could learn to respect each other's rights. They could learn that there was more to be gained from trade than from war, that peace was a natural state that mankind could achieve. The horrors of war could become a thing of the past. We know from tragic 20th century history the National Socialists' eagerness to use war as their primary tool of achieving their international goals. We know of their praising as fundamental the martial spirit and the beauty of the warrior. We know of their total recasting of the education of children to achieve, as Hitler wanted, a brutal, domineering, fearless, cruel youth. Youth must be all that. It must bear pain. There must be nothing weak and gentle about it. The free, splendid beast of prey must once again flash from its eyes. The beast of prey phrase is again rhetoric inspired directly by Nietzsche. On the importance and nobility of war, Nietzsche and the Nazis were in full agreement. Nietzsche praised war and urged its coming. He wished for a great purge that would wipe out most humans, whose lives he thought worthless and an embarrassment to the human species. All too many live, and all too long they hang on their branches. Would that a storm came to shake all this worm-eaten rot from the tree. But he also longed for war as a means to inspire those humans who have the potential to advance us toward the overman. And to that end, Nietzsche believes war is absolutely essential. War essential. It is vain rhapsodizing and sentimentality to continue to expect much, even more to expect a very great deal from mankind, once it has learned not to wage war. For the time being, we know of no other means to imbue exhausted peoples, as strongly and surely as every great war does, with that raw energy of the battleground, that deep, impersonal hatred, that murderous cold-bloodedness with a good conscience, that communal, organized ardor in destroying the enemy, that proud indifference to great losses, to one's own existence and to that of one's friends, that muted, earthquake-like convulsion of the soul. And against those who believe that we have entered a more peaceful era and that perhaps war is no longer necessary, Nietzsche reminds us again in an especially chilling quotation, "The beginnings of everything great on earth are soaked in blood thoroughly and for a long time." On this score, the Nazis were thoroughly Nietzschean. Rather than pushing for a recognition of the mutuality of human interests, as Western liberal capitalists have been doing for much of the 19th century, and rather than seeking reasonable and peaceful diplomatic solutions to the ordinary collisions of international politics, the Nazis committed fundamentally to war as their means of self-regeneration and dominance in world politics. A fifth and final set of themes link Nietzsche with the Nazis. Both were anti-democratic, anti-capitalistic, and anti-liberal. The Nazis were no friends of democracy, but they were effective players of democracy. Right from the beginning, in their founding document, the 1920 Party Program, they announced their authoritarian political principles. Nonetheless, finding themselves operating in a democracy, the democracy that was the Weimar Republic of the 1920s, they played mostly by the rules and simply out-democracied the other parties. They used democracy to achieve anti-democratic ends. Nietzsche's political views are less developed and more ambiguous, but it is clear that he favors some sort of aristocracy. "What is serious for me," Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, "is the European problem as I understand it, the cultivation of a new caste that will rule Europe." Again, while Nietzsche is unspecific, he most likely does not mean a formal political aristocracy. He most likely means the de facto rule by an exceptional few, whatever the formal and official political structures happen to be. In this way, while Nietzsche despises the impulses that give rise to democracy, he's not particularly worried by the dominance of actual democratic forms of government. He sees them simply as instruments that the exceptional few will use, most likely from behind the scenes, to achieve their ends. As he puts it, democracy will be a tool of a master race, the future masters of the earth, philosophical men of power and artist tyrants who will employ democratic Europe as their most pliant and supple instrument for getting hold of the destinies of the earth. Nietzsche is not programmatic about what specific form the new aristocratic class will take or what specific goals it will pursue. He believes that will be up to the overmen themselves. They will create their own values and shape the institutional vehicles by which they'll achieve them. Nietzsche did not think of himself as an overman, merely the herald of their arrival. But Nietzsche is exceptionally clear that any social method, however brutal, will be legitimate if the new aristocratic class desires it. A healthy aristocracy, as Nietzsche puts it, accepts with a good conscience the sacrifice of untold human beings who, for its sake, must be reduced and lowered to incomplete human beings, to slaves, to instruments. That is certainly anti-liberal, and it fits well with Nietzsche's self-assessment that he is not by any means liberal. In addition to dismissing liberalism, Nietzsche also dismisses capitalism as a dehumanizing system, and he also rejects individualism when it comes to matters of sexuality and marriage. Marriage, he thought, should not be based on an idiosyncrasy, that is to say, on personal love and sexual attraction. Rather, he suggests marriage should be state-run for breeding purposes. On all of those points, the Nazis can and did find inspiration in Nietzsche's philosophy. So, again, to summarize, we have 5 significant connections between Nietzsche and the Nazis. First, the Nazis were strongly collectivistic, and Nietzsche, with some qualifications, also advances strongly collectivistic and anti-individualistic positions. Second, both Nietzsche and the Nazis see zero-sum conflict as inescapable, as fundamental to the human condition. Third, both are irrationalists in their psychological theories, downplaying radically the role that reason plays in life and emphasizing the power and the glory of instincts and feelings. Fourth, both Nietzsche and the Nazis accept willingly, even longingly, that war is a necessary, healthy, and even majestic enterprise. Fifth and finally, both Nietzsche and the Nazis are anti-democratic, anti-capitalistic, and anti-liberal, and so come the 1930s in fundamental opposition to those nations in the West that were still broadly committed to democracy, capitalism, and liberalism. We know from historical hindsight that it took a world war to defeat the Nazis. Tens of millions of people died in that war, actual human beings who lived, loved, cried, had dreams, and then died long before they should have. Millions of others had their lives damaged or seriously disrupted. And over above that, the economic and cultural costs of the war, the wrecking of people's homes, the obliteration of works of art, the destruction of historical landmarks, all of those costs are probably incalculable. The Nazis lost that war, but it was a close call, and there's no guarantee that it won't happen again. And this is why it's absolutely important that we really understand National Socialism. By the 1930s, the Nazis had the entire intellectual, cultural, and political muscle of Germany at their disposal. Over and above that, they had an idealistic philosophy that motivated and energized millions. More than anything else, that intellectual and idealistic power made the Nazis an awesome force to be reckoned with. History has taught us that the philosophy and ideals the Nazis stood for are false and terribly destructive. But we do not do ourselves any favor by writing the Nazis off as madmen or as an historical oddity that will never happen again. The Nazis stood for philosophical and political principles that appealed to millions, that attracted some of the best minds of their generation, and that still command the hearts and minds of millions of people in all parts of the world. And that means that we must understand the National Socialist philosophical and political ideals for what they actually are. We must understand them. We must know where they came from. We must understand their intellectual and emotional power. Then and only then will we be able to defeat them. And we will be able to defeat them because we will understand their power, and we will be able to develop more powerful arguments with which to fight back. Arguing over philosophical and political ideals is often unpleasant, and the issues involved are often complex, abstract, and emotionally difficult. But there are no shortcuts, and perhaps the best motivation for doing the hard work is to remind ourselves regularly and often how much more it costs to settle disputes by war. We may not like that the Nazis had arguments and positions that many people find attractive. We may find it repulsive to take their arguments seriously. We might find it difficult to get inside their heads to see where they're coming from. But we have a choice. We can either fight them in theory, or we can fight them in practice. We can either fight them in the intellectual realm, or we can fight them on the battlefield. It might still come to fighting them on the battlefield, but that is always the most terrible option, the option that is the most expensive in every way possible, and the one we should avoid if there is any other way to defeat them. So that means that defeating National Socialism intellectually is the strategy that we should follow first. Defeating them intellectually means taking their positions seriously, understanding them, and knowing how to argue against them. The second rule of politics is know your enemy. Of course, the first rule of politics is know yourself. Know who you are, what you stand for, and why. Know what matters to you fundamentally, and what you are willing to do to achieve it, and when necessary, to defend it. That is, of course, a very large project, which is why a culture's philosophers and intellectuals do valuable work, or, if they get it wrong, great damage. But as an indication of where to start on this large project, let me sketch out the following. Philosophically and politically, the Nazis stood for 5 major principles. They stood for collectivism, for instinct and passion, for war and conflict, for authoritarianism, and for socialism. That means that we can identify the principles that, in each case, are the opposite of what the Nazis stood for. The Nazis stood for collectivism. The opposite of that is a philosophy of individualism that recognizes each individual's right to live for his or her own sake. The Nazis stood for instinct and passion as one's basic guides in life. The opposite of that is a philosophy of reason that has a healthy confidence in the power of logic and evidence to guide one's life. The Nazis stood for war and conflict as the best way to achieve one's goals. The opposite of that is a philosophy that encourages productiveness and peaceful trade as the best way to achieve one's goals in life. The Nazis stood for political authoritarianism and top-down leadership. The opposite of that is a philosophy that leaves individuals maximum liberty and freedom to live their lives by their own choices and direction, as long as they respect the equal right of other individuals to do the same. The Nazis stood for socialism and the principle of central direction of the economy for the common good. The opposite of that is the system of capitalism, with individual producers and consumers deciding for themselves what they will produce and what they will spend their money on. As a start, the principles in the right-hand column are the best antidote to Nazism we have going. Each of those principles is controversial in our own time, and I expect they will continue to be so for generations to come. But they represent the starkest possible philosophical contrast to National Socialism, and they form the first line of intellectual defense against future incarnations of Nazism. There's no better place to start than with understanding them thoroughly. I will end by stressing this point in a provocative way. The Nazis knew what they stood for. Do we?